Hey everyone, I'm Evan. Welcome to another episode of the ProfNoctis Show. This week we are interviewing Darryl from FFUnion. Get to hear all about the history of their channel and their website, all the articles and videos that they produce. It was really fun to get to learn that story. Also, we get to learn a little bit about how they tracked fan reception for the game. They had a unique approach that they did that you don't want to miss. It was a pretty creative way to try and figure out how people were interacting with the game and how they were progressing through it. He gives some perspective on some interviews with the developers, so you get some insight into the development cycle based on his experience and knowledge over the years. And of course, we're getting into those fan theories. So thanks for taking the time to listen. We hope that you'll like and subscribe. It super helps us out, and we appreciate you. And so with that, I get to say it this week. Let's mosey.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the ProfNoctis Show. I'm here as usual with Evan, and today we're delighted to have a very special guest, Darryl from Final Fantasy Union. Hey Darryl.
Hello.
So for those that may not know, Final Fantasy Union has been around for, gosh, how long, Darryl? When did FFUnion start?
In its current incarnation on YouTube, it's coming up to, I think, 7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years.
But as an entity, I think coming up to sort of 16.
Whoa. See, that's what I remember. I remember just the earliest days, the kind of earliest iterations, I particularly remember things on Final Fantasy 13. That is vividly in my mind.
Yep.
So I guess that would be 2010, 9, something like that.
The website launched. I remember when the website launched more than when the YouTube launched, because that was like the foundation bit. It launched in August 2008.
Oh, wow. Well, we are going to get into all of that, the timeline and the history, but I can't thank you enough for being on here. This is kind of a geek out moment for me, just because I've followed your content for so long. It feels like I'm with a Final Fantasy legend and celebrity today. I know that I am, but it's like even though we have talked a few times at this point, it's still just cool that you're in my house. It's so weird. That's but thank you so much for being here. I can't express.
Oh, you're welcome.
As we get going, for those that may not be familiar, though, if you're in the Final Fantasy community, what are you doing not knowing this? Could you share a little bit about what your channel is, what the content is? What do you do?
Sure. So I run a YouTube channel called Final Fantasy Union, and I run it with a team now of people, and we create content that is designed to celebrate the franchise. So we decided early on that we didn't want to be out there kind of telling people what to think or how to feel. It's a very diverse fan base and a franchise now, especially because of what's happened in the past 20 years. And we wanted to basically make a platform where no matter what game you like, you're celebrated. So if you like Final Fantasy 12, good for you. If you like Lightning Returns, great. If you like Crystal Chronicles, Ring of Fate, it's whatever game that you like, we wanted to make a place where you feel represented, essentially. And obviously we do that through lots of different types of content. We do sometimes lean into opinion, but even then we will try to make sure that our opinion is evidence. So it's not just me saying, okay, I'm Darryl and here's what you should think. It's kind of like, okay, here's what a large group of people think, and you can use that as a way of potentially quantifying why you feel the way you do. Yeah, so that's kind of what the platform is in a nutshell.
That's awesome.
That's really neat. You're talking about you arrived at this idea that you wanted to celebrate the franchise. And that seems like very intentional language that I imagine was crafted with your team and others based on, as you said, evidence, right? Based on your experience and things that you had done on that journey. I know that this platform has taken some twists and turns and evolutions as time has gone on, and we definitely want to get into that. But I wonder if you could just talk about how you and your team arrived at this idea that you wanted to celebrate the franchise, because that seems like a very intentional like language to use to describe what you do and make decisions about your channel.
So, I mean, Final Fantasy Union has been around for a long time. And in my youth, I was, let's say, a bit more opinionated. I used to do a weekly editorial piece talking about something. And, sometimes they would be evidenced. I remember I did a piece talking, especially after 13 transitions to being on the Xbox, and there was a lot of uproar about that. People felt betrayed around it. So I did a piece that essentially showed that Square Enix didn't really necessarily have any loyalty to a specific platform as a company. Like Final Fantasy as a brand was obviously very PlayStation orientated, but as a company, Square Enix had often just supported the platform that had the potential to make them the most money. And if you looked at, PlayStation was the dominant system, and the PlayStation 2 was also like even more dominant, but they'd actually supported like the DS like incredibly well. They released tons of games on that system, and Xbox 360, even if people didn't necessarily like it at the time, had done a really good job of stealing market share away from PlayStation. So it wasn't, and they'd also done the exclusivity deals around like Infinite Undiscovery and other games like that. So it wasn't too surprising. But yeah, so I would do opinion pieces like that to basically kind of push back on some of the things people were saying, but also sometimes to be quite critical about what Square Enix are doing as a company. And we also had a podcast where we would talk about news, and sometimes in that forum, we would talk about our personal preferences in quite a considerable fashion in terms of games that we liked, games we didn't like. I know that especially when we were building up to Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 12 was very much a divisive game. There were pockets of the fan base that really liked it, but generally the sentiment was if you were someone who liked kind of like the quote unquote golden era of games, so like 7, 8, and 10, 12 didn't really resonate that much. At least that was the sentiment, and so we used to kind of rag on 12, maybe sometimes a bit too much. And I noticed in kind of the feedback that we were getting that when we started doing it, people were very much on board with it because that's how they felt too. But over time, it kind of got that maybe you're being a bit too harsh on 12 nowadays. So I started to become really aware of how what we said kind of affected people, and I don't think we really wanted to be in a position where we were making people feel bad about like the things that they liked. Like no one wants to be in that place where you want to talk about something with your friends and you have the other friend who's just like, really, you like that, what's wrong with you, kind of thing. And like we used to get a lot of people reaching out to us essentially saying that they listen to the show because they love Final Fantasy and they live in a place, maybe in America, where they don't have anyone else they can talk to about the franchise. That's really cool. And so listening to me, Lauren, and whichever other co-host we had on there, so we had Colin, Spencer, people like that, listening to the three of us talk about the games was basically like them talking with their friends. That's like really listening to people who had similar opinions to them. And I think, we started because we would do surveys every now and again to see how people felt. There started to be a very clear situation where we would find that people they were affected by what we were saying essentially. So when we decided to go on the YouTube channel, we started to try and figure out how we could change essentially and create a different kind of environment, and essentially try and create that platform where no matter what you like, you're celebrated, you're seen, and you're heard. And we didn't want to make anyone feel bad about the games that they liked.
Well, a quick follow-up, because I know that Wade has something. Do you think Final Fantasy 12 and Final Fantasy 13 had a more challenging reception? Because that's the first one that they started giving all of the protagonists emo hairstyles, or do you think it was something else? Because that's where the hair really started to come down across the eyes, and I think it really impacted people.
No comment.
No comment. That's good answer. Good answer. You mentioned what I would consider kind of the secret sauce of Final Fantasy Union, the celebration of all of the different iterations of Final Fantasy. You even included Crystal Chronicles a little earlier, and I think that one thing that we sometimes say is every Final Fantasy is someone's favorite. And there's a Final Fantasy for
Yeah.
every type of gamer, especially today after we've moved into action and all of this kind of stuff. Have you ever considered, as you've looked over, tried to evidence all of the statistics and facts surrounding these games, have you ever tried the challenge of defining what Final Fantasy is? If you were to be asked, what is Final Fantasy to a brand newcomer? I don't know if anybody is better researched than you. What might
I
you
think
say?
to answer that question these days is actually incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
I think if you'd have asked me that question, from the inception of the franchise up until maybe like 2001, 2002, it would have been a much simpler answer. But where we are now, it's much more complicated, and I think it's best evidenced by when people ask the creators themselves. They all give completely different answers as to what a Final Fantasy game should be to them, and the whole thing is that none of them are wrong, but also none of them are right. It's one of those weird kind of paradoxical things where it's grown into this entity that has morphed into something that I think it was never meant to be. And there are these kind of fables around the series that become much bigger or have been given much more importance than was ever meant to be the case. I mean, like, there's obviously the whole thing about that the naming of the game was because the company was going bankrupt. Sakaguchi has said so many times that that is just not correct.
Not the truth. Yeah.
But that lie, it makes sense to people, so therefore it's easy to believe. And I think that one of the things around that seems to be used to define the franchise these days is that it has to be innovate. Every game has to be different.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be different, and that's not what they used to do. But it seems to have been used as a kind of justification for a lot of the changes that have been made, essentially. And I think, like, in terms of defining it, it's just, I think we're at the point now where it's as long as if there's a name associated to it, it's whatever they want it to be. And I think as soon as they did Final Fantasy 11 as a numbered game, it was very clear that that was their intention too, because they had lots of internal discussions about whether it should be a numbered game, whether it shouldn't be a numbered game. I think it was kind of 50-50 in the end, but Sakaguchi was one of the people that fought for it to become a numbered game because he felt as though story is one of the most important aspects of the game, the Final Fantasy brand, and he felt that Final Fantasy 11 had a strong enough story to be considered alongside the previous mainline entries. So why wouldn't we call it Final Fantasy 11 instead of Final Fantasy Online, which was the other big option?
We've talked a lot about, audiences and fan bases and the history of the game. What's your personal history with the game? What do you like about them? What was captivating to you? And when were you first introduced to them? Talk to us a little bit about your experience and journey with the franchise just as a fan.
So I think everyone has kind of their own unique story when it comes to how they got into the franchise. As a European, I had literally no clue the franchise existed before 7 was even mentioned.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
I've actually, I mean, like, because it just it didn't exist over here. Well, I've actually learned that it did, but it just wasn't even called Final Fantasy.
What was it called?
I want to let's take a little pit stop here. What is that like? Because I want to talk maybe a little bit about what it was like to play RPGs and story driven games back then, because that's a bit of a departure from our experience. The cinematics that came with 7 pushed a lot of it. A lot of Final Fantasy for us, 1, 2, and 3 was like word of mouth and friends and game shops and renting it from the video game store and that kind of stuff. But it sounds like there was a different kind of path that you guys had in the UK. Let's divert a little bit and chat about that, and then we'll get back to what you love about the game.
Yeah, so I mean, role-playing games weren't that prevalent over here, at least from my perspective. And from what I've learned, the first game Final Fantasy adjacent game over here was Final Fantasy Adventure, which obviously wasn't even a Final Fantasy game, but was rebranded as that in North America. That was released over in Europe as Mystic Quest. And when Mystic Quest was then released, it was supposed to be released over here as Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, but somewhere along the line, I'm actually doing. We're going to be publishing a video soon. It may be live when this goes live about the history of Mystic Quest, and I found a really old article in a UK magazine where someone tried to explain Final Fantasy because no one knew, and it's crazy. He's like, yeah, so the franchise is Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on the Game Boy, and then there's 3 and 4, which is also called 2, and like it's just all over the place. Like he didn't even seem to be aware that there was Final Fantasy 1 and 2 on like the Famicom or the Nintendo Entertainment System. So that was like our perspective. And then Mystic Quest ended up being rebranded over here. So Final Fantasy was completely removed and it was called Mystic Quest Legend, which then technically replaced or made it seem like a sequel to Mystic Quest, which was a Saga game.
Right.
Sorry, no, Mana game. No, Saga.
Mana. Was it Mana?
Mana. Adventures Mana. Yeah. But then obviously like Mystic Quest itself is essentially a Saga game. So it's like it's all over the place in terms of like, but yeah. So I had no real clue about role-playing games. I kind of grew up playing like Amstrad, which is kind of similar to ZX Spectrum, so having to wait 20 minutes for the cassette to load to play a game. And then my first like console experience was the Mega Drive. Genesis for North Americans. And so I was very much into games like, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Sonic, Road Rash, Rocket Knight Adventures.
One of my favorites. Rocket Knight Adventures.
Like
I love it.
Such a great. But very much like action-focused games. I'd never touched a role-playing game in my life. And then I got really into PC gaming. So my parents somehow afforded a PC, and the world's worst spec by today's standards, like a 50 megahertz processor with like 4 meg of RAM,
which was world changing.
And even though I was like 10 years old, they just basically just gave me the keys to the kingdom. So it was like Windows 3.1 DOS. And I was like going into the config.sys and autoexec.bat back then, like modifying the boot settings of my computer to try and like change memory allocations to make sure that PC games would function correctly. But then, like I was playing games like, Command and Conquer, like all the RTS games, playing Grand Theft Auto when I was like 12, and lots of first-person shooters as well. So role-playing games were just completely nowhere even in my field of view. But this is where things get super strange. So I didn't have a PlayStation. I completely missed Final Fantasy VII launching on the PlayStation and the huge thing that happened around it. But my next door neighbor, who was a couple of years older than me, his sister was a flight attendant, and she used to occasionally fly over to Asia. And she flew to Malaysia on one trip and brought back with her a bootleg copy of Final Fantasy VII. And so he started playing it, and I used to go around and watch him play games occasionally, and I just kind of sat and watched him play this game, and I was like, well, this is like strange. It's like it's kind of slow paced, but also there's a story. Like I was used to like, games like Streets of Rage, there is no story.
Right.
I used to get my story from Sonic the Comic, to anyone who ever read that.
Yes, same.
Because I know the US and the UK Sonic the Comic was slightly different, but in the UK they had like comic strips for Streets of Rage and Golden Axe. Like Kid Chameleon was another great one, which like built our backstory for. That was like where I got my narrative from these games. Yeah. So to see a game that actually had like a proper story was just unlike anything I'd ever really seen before, outside of like, corny cutscenes in Command and Conquer.
Oh, but they were great.
They were great.
So memorable.
We have talked. Everybody from the UK has played Command and Conquer. Like it's come up in everybody's history because we all watched the same cutscenes, and just the accents in those cutscenes were amazing.
They were great. So I still remember. You still remember a lot of the characters there. It's crazy. I remember you had that kind of assassin character called Tanya who just absolutely destroyed everyone by herself. But no, so yeah, I was watching him play this game, and then I'd never really done it before, but I was like, can I borrow it? But because it was a multi-disc game and he wanted to continue playing it, he was like, well, no, I'm still going through it myself. So I had to wait until he finished disc 1 for him to then give me disc 1. And then really frustratingly, because I was always tinkering with my computer, my parents had actually just got me a new processor. And so I'd put that in there. And most of the games I was playing had no problems whatsoever. But Final Fantasy VII had a hardware conflict that it created. So I couldn't get through the opening bombing mission without the game crashing.
Oh.
But it took me a while to figure it out, because PC games were notorious for having problems, right? You kind of have to figure things out and figure out what's broken. And I eventually switched out the processor, and then the game, I could get through it, but the game played worse. So I was like, okay, do I want to play an inferior game where the graphics don't look quite as good and the frame rate isn't quite as good, or do I want to play it better but have the chance that it crashes? I chose the play it better and have the chance it crashes. So I must have played through that opening bombing mission about 30 times until I finally got through it. And then the game, after that, it didn't crash for a while. So I was very, very, very happy about that. But
oh my goodness.
Yeah, I had a lot of dedication to play through that game. So that's kind of my exposure to the game. But because of the whole disc sharing thing, I ended up having more drama with it. And that happened at the end of disc 2 after beating Hojo. I needed disc 3, but my next door neighbor was out. And
you had to wait?
I had to wait. And because back in those days, there was screen bleed was a real thing. Mm-hmm. So I turned the monitor off because I didn't know how long my next door neighbor was going to take to come back. And my dad turned off the computer because he thought it was off, because he thought it was off. So he went to turn it on.
Oh no!
No!
And then when I tried to beat Hojo again, which was actually a really hard fight for me at the time, it took me ages to beat him. And then I encountered the same thing again. I couldn't get through the cutscene before the disc change without the game crashing.
No!
That's so.
Yeah,
I went through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to finish that game.
Yes.
But the other thing is that by playing on PC, which is a very, very fringe experience, I think, I experienced a different soundtrack. So the PlayStation is very standard, but when you play on PC, it was the sounds changed dependent on your sound card. And I was into music production. Yeah. I was kind of into music production, and so you could actually make the soundtrack sound quite different. My personal feeling, and I don't know if either of you listen to it, but if you go on YouTube and you look up the Final Fantasy VII XG soundtrack, it sounds like, in my opinion, a lot better.
Okay.
The one thing was, though, that because it was all MIDI based, there was no choir. They couldn't use audio samples. Okay. So I beat Sephiroth, and I was kind of like, it's okay music, it wasn't anything to shout home about. And then I went to school, and people were like, I found people who had started played the game previously. They're like, what do you think about the choir and the thing? And I was like, what are you talking about? There's no.
Mine's a harpsichord.
Yeah. But pretty much, it's just kind of it's like the choir sound effect that was playing.
You didn't have it. So because you had a sound, how did you determine that was the first time you realized that the sound was different? Was when and everybody's talking about it?
I had no clue that I was the soundtrack I was listening to was different to everyone else's. So it was quite surreal to hear people being like, yeah, no, there's like this whole choir play, but I couldn't evidence it. Like I couldn't just go around to some, like no one has like a save file there you can just load up typically.
Right.
Well, maybe they do, but no one showed it to me.
Wade used to go on forums and chat rooms and lie to people about how to save Aerith. And
to revive her.
He would give them fake guides.
Yeah.
He was a little troll.
I did this for several things.
This is
how to unlock Luigi in Mario 64. I created a step-by-step thing, and people would comment. I'd be like, "You're just doing it wrong. Like, just try this next time." And like, I would troll them.
OG troll. Yeah.
Oh man, I was like the first one, and so it's amazing. Darryl, I've got to appreciate everything that you just said, because you so well encapsulated my experience with PC gaming, even now in the year of our Lord 2024, because it's like so customizable, and I never get it right, and like it just breaks on me.
You're doing great.
And then Evan has to come and fix my computer, and that's what happens. So thank you, my audience appreciates that.
It was
hate mail will come. I don't know.
I've been through so many different things. I remember once when I was a very impressionable, like 12 or 13-year-old who was just trying to fix stuff, like and random things. Like one time my PC didn't boot because the fuse broke in my keyboard. I couldn't play a game, and it was coming up with a file that was causing a problem or something. And I went into the local game store and I was like, what should I do? And they were just like, well, just delete the file. Turns out that file was like the kernel for Windows. You live, you learn.
Yeah, you live, you learn. Like that's it. Like I don't understand the blood moon sacrifices and the planets aligning that have to happen for my games to work on PC. Those of you that do PC
nowhere near as bad as it used to be.
It's better than it's ever been. I mean,
that's what I understand. But
you used to have to actually change like physical switches and pins.
Yeah.
Like I could never get my computer to boot, and I just could not figure it out. And it's because I hadn't moved the pin on the hard drive for the main one and the secondary one. They were both set on main, so it didn't know which one to pull from. And that wasn't like a software thing. That was like a literal piece of plastic that you had to take out of the back and this tiny little 5-pin thing on the hard drive. And so lesson learned though.
And you are younger than me. Like what?
I think it's definitely one of those things that people don't necessarily appreciate how much testing has to go into making sure a PC game works these days. Because like back when, in like the late 90s, like there was not really any QA testing. Like if it didn't work, it was your problem. Whereas now it's like, if it doesn't work, it's the developer's fault. Yeah. You didn't test my exact configuration.
And now you can emulate, like I think it was maybe Windows 10 or, don't quote me, this isn't evidenced, when you could emulate older versions of Windows inside of the actual OS. That was such a game changer because you could go back and play your old games for the most part because you could emulate. So like I remember I had to like emulate one thing inside of another thing. And then I was like, boom, here I am. I'm playing Commander Keen, like back in business.
Yep. My big one is XCOM. I don't know if either of you play XCOM.
Yeah.
XCOM Apocalypse is one of my absolute favorite games. Never finished it. Doesn't matter. I love everything about that game, and there's some music in that game that's fantastic as well. But yeah, it's just when I was able to replay that game last year, it made me so happy.
What is it that you like about that one specifically?
Yeah.
I'm not too sure. I played Enemy Unknown, Terror from the Deep, and I think XCOM Apocalypse it elevated everything that those games were without really taking anything away. So for anyone who has no experience with XCOM whatsoever, it's essentially you're dealing with a doomsday scenario where something comes to threaten the planet. Mm-hmm. With XCOM Apocalypse, it was actually based on a city. And the city was essentially a living, breathing ecosystem. So there were about, I think, 20 or 30 different companies that worked in the city, and they all provided some kind of different service. So you had like the police force, like arms dealers, you had people that made petrol, like fuel. There were actual cults who were celebrating the aliens and were doing everything they could to help their conquering of the city. And the whole thing was that every day or every couple of days there would be an alien invasion, and they would beam aliens down into certain parts of the city, and all of the buildings were owned by these companies. And if you didn't do something to deal with the problem, the companies would gradually become assimilated by the aliens, and then they would become more hostile to you. So, for example, if you were having to buy weaponry, if the company, which one of the companies was Marsec, if they had become slightly infiltrated by the aliens, they would increase their prices. And you could bribe companies to give them more favorable stuff, but and like you could but there's huge research as well. So you would need to like capture aliens, dead or alive, their technology, and then research it to help influence your own technology development as well. And that's kind of how the game progressed. Like when you past certain periods of time or had developed certain levels of technology, the aliens would essentially adapt, and they would send the good stuff. Essentially, they'd start off by sending scouts, testing you out and seeing how you would deal with it. After a while, they'd then start sending like slightly more aggressive stuff, and you could play the game in real time or turn-based as well. And there were pros and cons to each approach. But the other thing was that your troops also progressed over time depending on how you set them up. So if you had troops that like survived a mission that went horribly, like their like mental resilience would go up.
Right, yeah.
Or if you gave them like really bad weapons that had terrible accuracy, but they managed to kill something with it, then they'd learn how to use those weapons and they'd become much more accurate with their shooting. So it was really cool, and you kind of got invested. Yeah, like you got very invested in these characters because like they'd been through the wars with you.
Right. It's like in Morrowind when you got athletics for jumping. So literally you just jumped everywhere in the game. Exactly. You're like, why would I not jump? Because I can get athletics. Wade, I think one of the things that we talk about a lot is the variety of gameplay styles and mechanics across the Final Fantasy series. Yeah. And it seems like, Darryl, you're really engaged with all sorts of different mechanics and gameplay loops. Wade, I wonder if there's anything that you're curious about with like any specific Final Fantasies and kind of...
Well, you know, more kind of along that same train of thought, like you have a very diverse interest in games,
right,
Darryl? This is something that I didn't actually know, but you've dropped first of all, Rocket Knight Adventures, love that. Sparkster, one of my absolute favorite. And then Grand Theft Auto and Golden Axe, and you've got all of this stuff, and yet you have a channel exclusively dedicated to Final Fantasy. How does this series kind of scratch all of the diverse itches that you have in your inklings for interest in gaming?
I'm not 100% sure, actually. I think part of it is just because I've probably invested more into this franchise than any other. I think because of the way I game and because I play so many different genres, I generally don't revisit games that often. And it's the same for Final Fantasy games as well. I've rarely played any of them multiple times, which is probably strange to hear. Like Final Fantasy VIII, still to this day, I have played once when I played it, and that is my memory of the game. And obviously, when I'm doing research for character stories or things like that, I'll kind of revisit certain parts and kind of refresh my memory slightly. But I like having that as my experience of the game. But like Final Fantasy VIII, like it was the game that really pushed my entire life journey. Like it influenced me probably more than any other game has.
Final Fantasy VIII, really?
Final Fantasy VIII, yeah.
So there's a lot of detractors to Final Fantasy VIII, as you've probably seen in message boards and stuff. What is it that you celebrate about 8? Full disclosure, I'm a big 8 fan. I love 8. Modeled my personality after Squall for a few years.
He likes swords and guns.
I know
there's
kind of detractors around the junction system. I didn't really have too many problems around the junction system, but I think it was 7 was a game where I got into it kind of afterwards on my own, essentially, and I kind of found some people at school that had played the game, and I found out that it was kind of a bigger thing. And but I was curious from that point on about, okay, this is the 7th game in the franchise, apparently. They're probably going to make more. But back then it was much harder to gain information about it. In the UK, though, there was a magazine that was produced exclusively by Official PlayStation Magazine around Final Fantasy VIII. And I remember getting that and playing the demo disc. Then after that, I didn't even know when the game was coming out or anything like that. But my friend kind of came around my house one day, which doesn't really happen anymore. It's just popping around someone's house just to say hi. He just came around my house to just be like, "Oh, did you know that Final Fantasy VIII released?" And I was like, "What?"
He's like the town crier. He's just riding his bike around your neighborhood.
So I literally hopped on my bike and went to my local game store, which I had this really strange relationship with because I used to play so many games and I was so young. It was like a local game store. It was not a franchise or anything. They had this really sweet deal with me where I had a loan system with them.
Oh.
So as long as I returned a game to them within 2 weeks of playing it, they would give me full price back so I could then trade it for another game.
That rules.
That's amazing.
Shout out to whoever that was
unnamed game
fostering that love for gaming and seeing you riding your bike there. I mean, I imagine that would be cool, but it's very cool now that you get to provide that service digitally that you wished would have existed as a kid that mirrors what those folks did for you. That's very cool.
That's awesome.
That's so crazy. I still think back to it. It was absolutely crazy that they kind of allowed, because games weren't cheap, right? It's Mega Drive games were, £45 to £50 still, which obviously is today's money is a lot more. It meant that I didn't get a massive catalog of games.
That's a unit of money for those of you. Their games didn't weigh more over there.
Thank you, Evan.
For those of us like me who are like, that's really heavy for a game.
That's super
and
heavy.
Really likes bad jokes. Sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, no, I hightailed my way to the store, picked up the Final Fantasy VIII Collector's Edition, which came with a T-shirt and poster. I gave my dad the T-shirt because back then it was not remotely cool to be wearing any kind of video game memorabilia whatsoever.
I remember those days.
I gave the T-shirt to my dad. He had no idea what it was. He wore it with pride, and I was like. You big
nerd.
Nowadays, that T-shirt would be really cool to have.
Yeah.
Do you think he ever got into some weird conversations because he was wearing that T-shirt?
I don't think anyone even knew what it was, honestly. I don't think he knew what it was. I don't think anyone he knew would have known what it was. I think, what's Final Fantasy? They probably thought it was a prog rock band or something. I don't know.
That's probably what it was. Probably a black T-shirt.
Yeah, as they are usually. So.
But yeah, so I always dabbled with music, so I taught myself how to play keyboard roughly from listening to demo tracks on keyboards and stuff. But I'd never taken it too seriously, never taken any formal lessons. And then I was playing, but I had a pretty decent keyboard setup, and I remember playing the landing, and I was just like Final Fantasy VII's music was good. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
but playing the landing, I was blown away, but not just the music itself, but also the development of the music. There's so many different passages and thematic segments throughout that piece of music, and I was fortunate to have a TV in my room at that point, so I wasn't having to game downstairs on the PC, and I just put my keyboard next to my TV, and I just stood there with Squall, and just let the music just play on repeat. And just gradually taught myself how to play that piece of music. And then it was this whole epiphany for me, because I then, and don't tell anyone this, I then handed that in as a composition at school, as if I'd written it myself. It was technically an arrangement.
Confession.
It was an arrangement.
Technically an arrangement. Yeah. It was an arrangement. It was transcribed for piano. But somehow it taught me how to play with both hands. Because I'd never really done that before, and so I figured out these different harmonies and stuff, and I kind of made the piece slightly my own. Mm-hmm. And then I did the same thing for the epilogue theme as well, and I kind of made these different tunes. And my teacher at school was like, "What the hell has happened to you? How can you suddenly just play a piano? You couldn't do this for the last 3 years of school.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And then I got segregated out. So I got put with like the musicians essentially. So when they had regular music lessons at school, I didn't do them anymore. I got put with other people who actually understood music. And then it was kind of like this weird awakening for me. And then I did GCSE music, which is like the first qualifications you do. And I played for my performance, I played Ami from Final Fantasy VIII, but I also did Melodies of Life from Final Fantasy IX with a violinist and
Oh my
God, what was the
gosh,
other? Yeah, we played like the grand piano in the assembly hall, and then I did music technology as well. And I started like getting into music production, and that's kind of how I ended up back into Final Fantasy, because I joined a Final Fantasy forum called Final Fantasy Music Online, and because I wanted feedback on my composition that I was doing, and I was like, who do I trust? I trust Final Fantasy fans, so I'm going to go to a Final Fantasy forum. They have like creativity segments, and I was like, well, I kind of know Final Fantasy, and I'm kind of into music, so maybe they'll give me some honest feedback about my work.
Oh wow.
I don't know. And then
they'll
I
be
ended up like
honest.
composing music for some indie games that never released anywhere. Did music production for A levels, and yeah, like kind of like joining the forum. Then I got to know quite a few people. I ended up going to university with one of them. One of them lived in the US, and I flew over to the US by myself to visit them when I was 18, which is
Oh my
absolutely
gosh.
insane.
That feels insane.
Where
Yeah.
did you
Yeah.
go in the States? Was it your first trip to the States?
Yeah, first trip outside the country.
Where did you go in the States? What was
it was
your
in
impression?
Oregon.
Or you went to Oregon?
Oregon?
The first place you visited in the United States was Oregon. You just flew to the Pacific Northwest and
Yeah.
it was like, okay, it's a forest.
And yeah, we did a road trip from Oregon to Colorado, and back again, taking a slightly different route. So I saw like tons of America. It was crazy. And then yeah, like it was back to Final Fantasy VIII. So that's why Final Fantasy VIII has that kind of importance to me.
Yeah, cool.
Because it but also I think a lot of people around my age, Squall kind of represented how I felt. He was very much similar to my persona with their way. I went to this is going to be a weird confession, but I went to an all boys school, and so we didn't really interact with girls that regularly. I kind of feel like that's how Squall is. He's kind of like, he doesn't really know what to do with the attention he's receiving. And I think there's a lot of people that were just kind of in that situation, whether that's kind of how they projected themselves, or that was the reality for them. If you were kind of like that 14 to 18-year-old kid, Squall was kind of like you in a way. But I think like the cast of characters also, they were just believable. It was like a school setting. I think everyone kind of knew the different tropes of character in some way that were represented within that cast.
Yeah.
And Final Fantasy VII didn't quite have that. Like I didn't know a Barrett, you know, I didn't know a Red 13. Like, you know, I you know, they were fun characters and everything, but it was really hard for me to kind of relate to them on that level. And also, like, you know, Cloud is supposed to be like 17, 18, but it's like no 17 or 18-year-old I know.
Yeah.
Whereas, Squall was a lot more relatable.
Well, and to that point, after Squall's reception, because he was very well liked by 14 to 18-year-old guys that were kind of coming of age and had those same levels of insecurity and uncertainty about how to interact with the world. It strikes me that we see, especially in the compilation, that Cloud is a little retconned in a Squall-like fashion, where he begins to take on more of that persona. And I wonder if that was on the devs' minds to say we can shift that. And certainly
Absolutely.
in Remake, we see a little bit more of that. Would you say
it happened? Yeah, no, it definitely happened. So I remember reading about it in the basically they had like the reunion files for Aberrant Children, and they talked about a lot of the development for
like
it.
facts for this. Of course you do. I love
And
it.
so they realized that after Final Fantasy VII, like Cloud is actually like a relatively cheerful guy. You know, like he has his mental issues, but once they're resolved, like he's not like depressed, downbeat.
Mhm.
Like, he's actually kind of like, let's go do it, guys.
Let's
Tries to be
mosey.
the
Yeah.
leader. Yeah, he tries to be quite positive because he knows that's what expected of him. He tries to kind of fill that leadership position. But then they realized that people had interpreted the character in a slightly different way to that, to how they wanted him to be, essentially. And instead of, well, they had two choices. They could either have doubled down on what they as creators wanted the character to be, or they could change to what the character was perceived to be. And they chose the latter option, essentially. So when Advent Children came around, they basically just completely changed Cloud's entire persona to match what they thought people wanted it to be.
That's such an interesting concept because as I think about kind of the development of Final Fantasy VII moving into Advent Children, Dirge, and these other pieces of media moving into remake, it's almost as though remake, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Remake is almost like a defense of that change that you see in Advent Children. It's almost like this is how we got there. That's an interesting. I haven't thought of that, Darryl. That's interesting.
It is. I mean, like with remake in general, I think it's a very strange project because the developers themselves have been very open about the fact they made the game already. They didn't want to make the same game again.
Right.
And there was also a lot of stuff that they couldn't do with 7 because they had such time pressures and all these different things that they wanted to do. So, I mean, one of the big things was that obviously Zack, they had written, like Nomura and Nojima had written a ton of stuff for Zack that they just couldn't put in the game because it was so last minute. And they thought was never going to see the light of day. But then they had the ability to make Crisis Core, so they were able to resurface a lot of that. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that people have around the remake project, that it's all just kind of being made up essentially for that game. But the reality is that a lot of it comes from stuff that they wanted to do before but weren't able to. Yuffie is another case in point. So she was in the original version of the game supposed to be in and around Midgar. So she was supposed to be seen during Midgar essentially.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but they had to cut most of it out. But obviously then that has resurfaced now in Intermission.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that they wanted to do but couldn't, and they have now essentially had the ability to resurface things where it makes sense to do so.
Well, it feels like we're moving into remake rebirth territory. Evan, do you have any other closing questions for Darryl's origin? Other things that are pressing heavily on your mind?
I think I'll ask one more question, and we can relate it back to Rebirth and kind of have that transition because we've definitely turned the corner. So I don't want to go back. You talk a lot about liking to evidence things. You think it's important to substantiate an opinion with at least some sort of research evidence. When it comes to the way that you perceive Rebirth and the remake trilogy as we're about to experience it, how has that evidenced perspective where you research and you have like a wealth of information impacted your play of the game? Are you able to experience it in just a natural way, or are you always thinking about all this research and things that you've done on the channel? And what is it like to play the game but not maybe be able to just relax and enjoy it because you feel like you have these other pressures? And has that been a shift from your earlier enjoyment of the franchise? And how has it kind of impacted the way that you've experienced the game?
I think I'm able to disconnect pretty well when I'm playing the games. I don't try to let my kind of all my other stuff worry too much. I try to keep things separate essentially. So when I'm playing a game, I like to play a game. I think one of the big things that I noticed, especially in the last sort of 5-10 years, is that it's hard to play games now without distraction. And I used to think back to when I was playing games as a kid where, there were no phones or, you didn't have dual monitors, like all these different things. Yeah. And so when you played a game, you were playing a game. And that was all you were focused on in that moment until your mom or your dad said dinner's ready and you were like, but I need to find a save point. You don't like nowadays, like I constantly found myself playing games, but just kind of not playing them.
Mm-hmm.
I would just be experiencing them, but I'd have Discord open or, someone would be messaging me or whatever. So I've tried really hard in the last sort of couple of years to make sure I just completely disconnect from everything. I might have like a notes document open, maybe where I'm just, because I often will review the games, especially Final Fantasy games, just to make sure that because writing stuff down, you retain it a lot easier. And I have a lot of stuff swirling around in my brain these days. So any kind of cues and things I can do to help myself is always helpful. But no, I don't think it's really affected me too much in terms of the channel and because I like games to be I like games to just have their own life cycle. Essentially, I don't go crazy making a ton of content about new games or anything like that, and I try to just enjoy them as a fan as much as possible, because I've been on the other side of it. Like, there are times where especially when we did news more regularly, where and I actually had it with Advent Children. I was part of an Advent Children community where they were just obsessed with everything Advent Children, and it ruined everything for me about it because I knew so many details about the film before it even come out, and I was like, well, why? I'm not going to enjoy watching this anymore because I've essentially spoilt the whole thing for myself. And it just, so I try where possible to keep a distance from things, so I can try and enjoy things as much as I can.
Yeah.
As going in fresh, which is obviously difficult when you're in this space too.
Yeah.
But,
it is.
Sounds like that's a very intentional choice for you, though. And if you're having to make that level of intentional choice to stay focused, it makes me think about the way that I experience these games. And if designers take that into account as they're making modern games, like the fact that they're competing with messages and other screens and things like that, that's interesting. You've given me a lot to think about.
I think they do. I mean, like, I think even like the what's the game what's the name of the guy who makes Smash Brothers? Is it Sakurai?
Yeah.
He has his game design YouTube channel, and he just did one about skipping cutscenes and how basically if you're making a game now and you don't have the ability to let people skip cutscenes, you're making a huge mistake. And it was very much around that people don't have attention spans anymore. Like they don't want to watch something again for a second time if they don't have to. And some people will skip cutscenes the first time they watch them because they're bored. Like, which is wild to me. But I even do see it a little bit. Like, sometimes. And I will confess that there were some side quests in Final Fantasy 16 where I did film myself skipping through the dialogue a little bit because I didn't want to wait for the voice acting. I just wanted to read it quickly.
Read it and move on, yeah.
But like not having that option is a bit of a frustration. But yeah, like I do try and experience things as much as possible in the intended form. Mostly with Final Fantasy. With other games, it's hard. I mean, I've got kids and stuff. They're wandering around all the time, and like it's hard to find time to just lock in to enjoy an entertainment product in that way. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that they will be taking those things into consideration these days.
But the active role that you're taking, you're choosing how you're going to play. It's a very intentional form of play because you know the environment that is going to help you enjoy the game and you want. So you're creating those boundaries in that space. And I wonder, maybe I'm just curious about it, if there's folks who allow those outside influences to impact their play too much. And we have to intentionally get back to that. Just this is my one-on-one experience of the game because it's curious. You want to know what people think about it. You're kind of wondering the whole time, but it's not fully baked. It's not done. It's not ready to be taken out of the oven. And we allow these outside influences to impact how we feel about these long games. And it creates an interesting environment for discussion and enjoyment and expectations of what you really should experience from a game too. So that's actually really fascinating. I love that you do that. Wade, sorry.
No, you're good. You brought up a couple of different things. First of all, Evan, you just hit on it. The idea of enjoying and celebrating a game for what it is, before you go online and realize that your opinion is wrong. I think that that's a major issue that we have in this franchise right now, right? I didn't realize that the mini games of Rebirth or the side quests of Final Fantasy 16 were game breaking and terrible until I went online and read all of these opinions. And because in my own, because I blocked and muted every word and every account that was going to spoil Rebirth and 16 for me until I finished it, and then I unmuted everybody. But I remember having a delightful time, every mini game, every side quest, all that kind of stuff. You, however, run one of the most, I would consider one of the most prolific, evidence-based channels on this series that's out there. Anytime I want an answer to a question I have, I go to FFUnion every single time about Final Fantasy. You're one of my first stops.
And recipes and other things. He's trying to squeeze a lot out of your
I'm just
content.
really trying to learn everything about life.
He had Final Fantasy Union open and the hood of his car open trying to change something. And I was like, wait, it's not in there. He goes, no, Darryl wouldn't do this to me.
Darryl never leaves me hanging. So knowing that you have all of this, I can imagine that it's really tough to turn that off. How do you intentionally manage your time, not just time management, but the intentionality
focus,
of turning everything off, focusing in, and then also managing all of the other things in your life? You have a full life, Darryl. Family, job, and then you're running this incredible channel. So basically, I'm asking you, how do you do it? You've been a guide for me in Final Fantasy. Be a guide for me in life. Go.
It's a challenge for sure, and I've definitely had to adapt over the years to modify kind of like what we do. I think like when we did the podcast, for example, and this is probably like crazy for people to hear, but we had, because we'd started it like 2008, sorry. I didn't even start the podcast actually. It was someone called Kyle and David. They ran a fan site called FinalFantasy13.net, and I guested on the podcast, I think episode 3. I'd never done a podcast or anything like that. Didn't like public speaking. I actually ended up buying like a microphone and loads of equipment to do it, and I was so nervous, like ridiculously nervous. But I had like a weirdly good time. And I ended up becoming really good friends with Kyle, and we launched a video game publication together, traveled all around the world, reviewed hundreds of games, met a lot of the Final Fantasy content creators and beyond because of that. But then we inherited the podcast when Final Fantasy Union as a brand took off, and then the podcast became, instead of becoming the FXN Final Fantasy 13 podcast, it became the Final Fantasy Union podcast. I've completely lost my train of thought though. How do we do it? But we had basically an objective of every Tuesday there will be whatever cadence. Sometimes the cadence changed from like bi-weekly to tri-weekly, but like there will be a podcast no matter what. It was just ingrained in us that this was going to happen, to the point where even after our first daughter was born, we still put out a podcast that within like the first week of having a newborn baby, because we were like, we can't let our audience down. Like they expect this podcast to come out. And there were a couple of times where like I did solo podcasts. I just talked for an hour and a half about something, which was weird. Because I'd never really done that before. It's hard to have a discussion by yourself. But we just had this weird dedication that it was going to happen. And it was the same when we started the YouTube as well. We were doing short videos. We did a video every day, and I would come home from work. I would write a script in an hour, and then Lauren would edit the video in an hour. And we would get it out, and she'd be like editing while like breastfeeding and stuff. Like we just like were like, this is what we want to do. And we made like zero money. We just for some reason had this just burning desire to just get this stuff out there. I still don't know why. I mean, there must be some thing deep within us that is just like, we need to tell the world about Final Fantasy for some reason. But yeah.
I love how the purpose pulled things in tow, though. Like, you were like, this has to happen. And because this has to happen, that's going to pull some of these other things into alignment, because they weren't individual decisions that needed to be made. You made the big decision, and then you allowed that to guide your downline decisions. And it's your values that kind of got you there. That's fascinating.
I think it's the celebration of things. You come to the franchise with this level of appreciation and much needed positivity, let me say. And I think that comes through in all the content that you create. And so even from, years ago, whether or not you had critiques of things that jived with you or not, I think that intentionality of saying this is worth celebrating and this is for those that appreciate the game already, here's something to appreciate more about it. That's been a constant mantra that we've even had on this channel, though you've given some new voice to it in a way that I had not thought about before today. And so the ability to be in this space without that overly critical eye, I can only imagine that is however you juggle your time and the intake of all this information. I hope that you are still able to enjoy these games for what they are.
You sound like you do, though. You do. You're
Genuinely
able to be a fan, and it's amazing.
I think similar to you, Wade. Like I especially with the more recent games, I've been fortunate to be able to play them essentially in a vacuum, so I don't have all this external noise. I think that was one of the, especially with 16, is one of the challenges I saw within the community, that people went into these games expecting to feel certain ways instead of just experiencing themselves. And like, when you go into a game and you're told that, it's super long-winded, you're going to do all these quests that you don't need to do, it's really boring, it's going to change your opinion about the game. Like, how could it not? And that was kind of surreal for me, because obviously I did a review for 16. Like, it wasn't 100% positive, but I looked at things, like the side quests, I looked at them from a different perspective. I was thinking, okay, are these side quests better than the ones they did in Remake? Yes, they are. Like night and day better than Remake side quests. And did they make me get invested in them from a narrative and story perspective? Yes, they did. Like, some of the end game 16 side quests, like, they will bring a tear to your eye. They are like brutally like good at what they do. So good, and I was kind of thinking about it from that perspective, and then obviously like the stuff kind of coming out, and I if you rush 16 as a game, I think the side quests are an annoyance. And there's also a lot of people that want side quests to deliver more than story. So there's people that do them because they want to get a really cool sword or an upgrade item or something like that. And the game didn't deliver that aspect for them, which I, understand.
Yeah. But
then it's one of those things where, okay, you can accept that criticism, but then you also have to be able to accept why people may like something. And, I've always tried to provide a balanced viewpoint on things. And obviously I do reviews very sporadically when games come out to try and give people obviously it's still my opinion, but I try and do it based on kind of evidence where you can in a review, when no one else can know what you're talking about. But like, obviously one of the things I've done as well is essentially do those big surveys after games come out, because one of the things I noticed was that you would have these massive things of discourse that come out. And I think with a Remake especially, I noticed it that and obviously with 12 and 13, but there was no way I could do anything about it. And 15, actually, I started with 15. I was like, 15 especially, people seem to hate this game, but do they actually? Is it just like a vocal minority saying these things and tarnishing the game? What do people actually think about it? And so I started doing these surveys that would actually show people how people en masse feel about these things. And it's been really interesting to see how people have reacted to that, because there is a sense of, oh, it's great to see people feel the same way. But where you have those kind of detractors that have the small pockets, essentially, they kind of look at it to be like, oh, maybe like everyone else actually does like this game. Okay. Not like, you're wrong, essentially, but maybe they're not looking at it from the right lens, or maybe they haven't appreciated kind of it the way that other people have. And I think it kind of opens people's eyes a little bit in terms of how people interact with games and enjoy games.
Yeah. I mean, intense emotions tend to get oversampled in free response formats, right? Like they do. Like it's just people who felt intensely either way are going to do it. If it was fine and you didn't hate it, you're typically maybe
people comment with extremes.
Yeah, what is everybody going to say? It was fine. Like people aren't going to do that. So it's cool to have a data set that made you want to break that down in a way. What are you curious about, Wade?
For the sake of my namesake, what were the results of that 15 survey? Do you remember just generally? Was it as widely reviled as Twitter would have us believe?
No.
That's all I need to know. Thank you.
Is the short answer. I mean, I think it got about like an 80% review score across the fan base. But like, if you listen to people, you'd think that it would be like a 5 or a 6,
5,
like worst game ever made,
right,
kind of thing. And I think but when you look at the results of everything, that survey was actually quite interesting, because they had done their own survey, if you remember, after episode The Sky.
I do.
And so I kind of mirrored that survey to see how people's opinions changed over time. But it also introduced some other things as well. People generally didn't like the DLC that much. I don't remember those kind of things, but it was where I made the survey more of my own, in terms of like I was curious to try and get answers to questions that I wanted to know. And also just like, with 16, that was the super interesting one, because I just talked about why I like the side quests, and I was curious to see if there was a correlation there. And side quests were one of the most vilified parts of the game in the survey, but there was a very clear correlation between those who rated the story higher rated the side quests higher. Like, it was like almost a 1-to-1 relationship. And there was other things as well, like in terms of difficulty with gameplay. People that wanted a more punishing gameplay experience liked the combat less. And you can draw these different things out, but obviously how you ask the questions, and different demographics will have different preferences, and it's quite interesting when you look at all of the stuff to see how people feel about things and why they do.
The research mind in me is just like loving every second of this, because it reminds me to my thesis and my dissertation. It's like, oh gosh, I love a good graph. I love a good chart of survey responses. But in our pre-show, you mentioned you had done some surveys about Rebirth, specifically in Remake and all of this stuff. And this is a great chance for us to move into that. But before we do want to toss it over to our minigame stretch break. So, everybody,
good transition.
Let's hop into that minigame stretch break.
Great transition, Wade. All right, everybody, it's that time of the episode where we get a little stretch in for our minigame stretch break. Fellas, let's get some stretching in.
Good stretch.
Everybody, this is our minigame stretch break where we get to know each other a little bit better and take a little bit of a break. So wherever you find yourself, whatever you find yourself dealing with, just take a moment, pause, get a little stretch in, let it out. You'll be just fine. And like every minigame stretch break, it wouldn't be started if we didn't hit our theme music. 3, 2, 1.
Oh, I've gone too long there.
No, you did great. That was so good. So, Wade, let's talk about our question deck. I have the bingo wheel of vulnerability here. We'll be picking a number 1 through 50 shortly. Wade, what questions are we pulling from today?
Today, we're going to be using the Heroes Journal side quest deck. This one is particularly space-themed. So space-time, Zach World, who knows? We'll get into it.
Space-themed. All right, Darryl, as our guest, you get to pick the number 1 through 50. What do you think it might be? 1 through 50.
We'll go 15.
15 is the number. Wade, what you got?
22.
I'm going 27. All right, 15, 22, 27. Darryl, tell me when, and we'll grab one. Go. All right, you picked it up. It's yellow. Numbers were 15, 22, and 27, right? 31.
Yes.
31.
31.
The number was 31. So, Wade, give us question number 31. Listener, if you guessed 31, let us know in the comments.
Okay, here it is. So a side quest deck is all about real life challenges, but I manipulate them into the form of a question. This side quest is, when was the last time you fixed something broken in your home? If nothing's broken, what is something that you just need to get around to doing? But when was the last time you fixed something in your home? What was the story about it?
I partially fixed our sink.
Oh,
Not remotely a plumber. And the sink was overflowing. And I was just like, there's like that little like round bendy bit at the bottom. I was like, clearly there's some sludge or something stuck in there.
It's called a P-trap.
There you go. I was like, it can't be that hard to take off and fix. So I did that, cleaned it out. It fixed the sink for approximately 1 day, and then it happened again. And we found out that actually the problem wasn't that. It was that the pipes outside our house were clogged up after 30 years of sludge going through them, and that was what fixed it. But I felt in my heart as though I had temporarily fixed it, and was moderately proud of myself for doing so.
I'm moderately proud of you too.
I am too.
You did great. It's always fun.
Okay, so mine actually involves you, Evan, and this isn't totally at my house, but it is at my second house, which is my work house. Okay, it's my work home. So literally this past weekend, Saturday night, it's the biggest football game of the year. It's Alabama versus Georgia. Evan and I got to go together. It's college American football, Darryl. So we go to this game, absolutely amazing time. It's late. We're taking some friends home to their apartment or whatever, and then I get a phone call, and it's from work. They said, "Hey, there's a urinal that is overflowing. Can you come back?" And so we return, fighting through the game day traffic, and the urinal is indeed overflowing, and we're talking erupting,
like the valve
spewing.
is busted.
Okay. The valve is busted and it's just shooting. And so we're like, oh my gosh. Now we do not have the proper tools to turn the water off at the urinal. So, and we try to jiggle the handle, the whole deal. Fortunately, there's a drain in the floor, so it's spilling onto the floor and just going straight down the drain, and it's just an endless cycle. We go outside at about 1 a.m., something like that, and we dig hands and knees, bare hands, through the mud to find the water panel to do the manual shutoff, and we still do not have the resources that we need for this sort of thing. So we leave the thing running for 15 hours till we get the proper tool the next morning, go back. Pretty quick fix. Evan takes it, gets the cap off, spins a flathead screwdriver, and we turn off the thing. So it didn't exactly fix it, but it was a home repair until an actual plumber could come by on Monday. So that was my story. That was nonsense. I'm still
temporary fix too.
Exactly.
We fixed the problem, which was the water was overflowing, and then we'll let someone else fix the problem, which is the valve. Yeah,
that's it.
I have a myriad of things. I'll talk about. I do a lot of work on the old house. You want to go plumbing? We can go plumbing.
It's all plumbing today, apparently. Yeah, go for it.
It's all plumbing all the way down. I had a section in my home that needed to be replumbed. We had a system that pulled water out, and we had hired someone to do it, and they did not do a good job nor complete it, which is very, very frustrating if you've ever hired a tradesperson who was unreliable. So just so you know, whenever you find somebody in your life that does really good work for anything around your home or your property, just pay them very well, thank them profusely, and don't try and get cute with it. Just go with the folks you know, and there's probably a reason that they might cost a little bit more. So I had to do this before I could leave town for a trip because the system needed to be functional before I left. And I replumbed had this vision and replumbed this entire outdoor section, tied it into a storm drain, and it's like ends up being like 20 to 30 feet of outdoor plumbing that then is now buried underground and tied into a storm drain. And it worked. It worked amazingly. I was so happy to be able to do it. I didn't have to hire anyone else to do that part of it because I was just like, I can't do this. But I felt extremely accomplished. And a professional came out and said, "Who did this?" And I said, "Me." And they said, "This is really well done." And I was like,
wow.
Oh, there you go.
This is all I needed. So thank you to all the plumbers out there who encourage those of us who do our own work.
Big love for plumbers in this minigame stretch.
Yeah,
it really is. So hey, you know what? Thank a plumber in your life, like that's what it is. So listener, let's talk about your home repair. What is something that you have repaired or overcome that made you feel a little bit satisfied, even if it was maybe a frustrating process to get it done? Because, we're all in this together. So hopefully you've had something in your life that was a challenge in your home that you've been able to overcome. And you know what? Think about a time that you did in your life and be a little encouraged. And if you have a looming problem that you've been putting off, we're going to pray for you because that is not fun.
So call a plumber.
Yeah. So hang in there. That's it. So hang in there. So let's get a little more stretch in, everybody, as we get back to that episode. Bye-bye.
All right. So Darryl, you mentioned doing all these surveys, all this research and stuff. You did some specific research for Rebirth. Talk to us a little bit about it.
I did. And I did a slightly different realm of research this time around, just because with 15, 7 remake and 16, I felt as though there was a lot of discourse in the community, and I felt that the surveys would be a good way of helping people to quantify why they feel the way they do. Rebirth is like almost universally loved. So I was like, what is a survey really going to show other than the fact that everyone really likes it? Like, there's not really anything that the stuff that people don't like, people know they don't like it, and it's not really that controversial anymore. And the stuff that people do like, they just like. So, there wasn't really. I don't think that in the same way as the first game, where there was a lot of things to learn, because Rebirth is very similar but just better in many ways. It would have essentially been like saying the same thing again. So this time I was like, well, what fun thing can I find out? And obviously playing through the game, I had gained an appreciation for how large it is.
Yeah.
But also how segmented the game is. Like it has a flow, but it's not necessarily like kind of like a natural flow, if that makes sense. There are clear points where people I felt would drop off, or they would kind of get stuck and they want to explore, or because people like with a game like Rebirth, there are so many different ways you can play the game. There will be some people that want to try and just beeline it and just ignore all the world stuff. But I feel as though with the way people are these days and with the way it was implemented in Rebirth, that they wouldn't do that. They would want to explore and experience everything. And so I thought, what's the best way that I can try and evidence this? Trophy tracking, right? Because you get to see how and when people are progressing relative to everyone else. So it's super interesting.
Talk about a little bit about, for those who are watching, we for some reason have folks who don't play games that will watch this. So when you say trophy tracking, will you just explain what the trophy is, why you're able to access it, and a little bit about why that's information that is made available to you to do this?
Sure. So ever since Xbox 360 era of console gaming, there has been trophies and achievements associated with games. And the idea would be that obviously in older games, there were certain feats you could accomplish that would kind of give you bragging rights amongst your friends. And older Final Fantasy games had tons of these. I mean, like Final Fantasy VIII is the one where I spent the most of my time. So beating Omega Weapon, for example, was a huge accomplishment. But it was just an accomplishment that you had for yourself. Essentially, like, I did this.
Yeah.
Some of your friends may care, but probably wouldn't.
Right.
But the notion of the trophy and achievement was a way that you could essentially show that you've accomplished something, and other people could then see you've done it. Obviously, as a mechanic, it's evolved significantly away probably from that initial objective because it's become very much a part of the gaming ecosystem now. There's people that play games only to get the trophies and the platinums and everything around it, as opposed to wanting to play the game for the game. But it's a good way, if the trophies are set up correctly, it's a very good way of tracking progress. And I actually saw this similar methodology in terms of the Souls games, because someone essentially used trophies to track where's the point where people quit. Like, what's the boss where people are just like, no, I'm done, I'm out. And I thought, well, you don't really have that same feeling in a Final Fantasy game. Most of them are actually pretty easy to play through. I don't think there's any Final Fantasy games that are particularly challenging, and you know, as a role-playing game franchise, it's notoriously forgiving in comparison to some others.
They're very generous with difficulty sliders too.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought with the way that the Rebirth was structured, and with the way the trophies were structured, it would be a really interesting study to see like how long it takes people to get to the end game, essentially. Like that was kind of my main initial objective, because you know, a lot of people these days have maybe like an hour or two to game a day, if that. Like they'll come home from work exhausted. If they don't have kids, obviously they can spend a bit longer, but if they do have kids and family, you know, the gaming time is quite precious. And so a game like Rebirth is going to take a significant period of time to get through, essentially. So I was curious to see how long it would take people en masse to get to that point, but also, how long it would take people to migrate from the different areas in the world. Like, how long does it take people to go from Calm to then go through to the sequence in Junon to then get to the next bit, etc. And it was quite fascinating in terms of, you know, what people typically did. And it was quite a lot more condensed than I actually thought as well. So one of the main things was that a lot of people played the prologue, chapter 1, and then just stopped.
Huh.
They didn't, like so after like day one of
Did
the
that
game,
physically
for
hurt
example,
you, Wade?
I'm just shocked.
So yeah, day one of the game, about 70% of the people who played the game that unlocked a trophy just stopped there and were like, "Yep, I'm good for now." And obviously they, you know, some of them would have come back later. But only about 30% of people decided to progress beyond that point in that particular day.
Okay, so in one day they would beat chapter 1 or the prologue, and then they would hold off for chapter 2. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. So this
Okay,
I'm
so
essentially tracking trophy progress by day.
funny story, that was me. I stopped at the end because I am a very specific, this is the close of a day chapter sort of gamer, and then I'm going to move on. Real talk, anytime since I was a kid, anytime in a game when you go to an inn, whether for story reason or just because I need to replenish my health, that is when I stop playing for the day. It is a stupid role-playing thing that I do, that my characters go to sleep. I do too.
I love this.
I've done it since I was like 8 years old. Truly. So anyway, I understand now. I thought you were saying they gave up on the game forever after chapter 1.
I mean,
That's why
some people would have done, right?
They definitely would have.
Obviously, I don't know how many people then migrated over to doing that. But yeah, so like I looked at it from two perspectives essentially. So how many people, how long it took the majority of players to get beyond chapter 1, and the answer to that question is, I mean, like, yeah, so 67% of people finished chapter 1 on day 1, and then of the people that were playing it. And obviously, like, the percentages get slightly warped because obviously over time more people are buying the game, so therefore the percentages will go up and down slightly. But it didn't until, like, it took about 90% of people have never finished. Well, within 60 days, 90% of people that started the game had not finished. Well, 10% of the people that started the game have not finished chapter 1.
Okay.
Which is, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they started by accident.
Yeah, 10%. That
it
would
took people.
not include people that downloaded the demo. That's not included
No,
in the trophy. Okay, just making sure. Because I know that it transfers over, but I couldn't remember. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think you get the trophy for playing the demo. I
Okay.
think it's separate. But no, it took people, yeah, like about, I think 85% of people had finished the prologue after day 5. So it took like almost a week for the bulk of people to like have moved on to, we've passed the prologue. But then there was like a big, like that was the big kind of slowdown. So there was a very clear chunk of the calm segment where those 2 chapters, people basically played back to back. Chapter 2, chapter 3 had a very, very close relationship. So essentially, people took a long time to do calm, and then they did the Mithril Mines straight after, and then they stopped. There are very few people who stopped before the Mithril Mines, essentially.
Interesting. Okay.
Why
That
do
is
you
chapter
guys
3.
think,
Chapter
based on
3
your
is Mithril
experience,
Mines,
why do
I
you
think.
think that is?
Yeah.
Like,
I think it's the way the game was structured. There were just natural cutoff points. You had those big open world areas, and then there were these really short story-driven chapters. And generally, like once you got through that open world area, you were just kind of like, okay, I'm in this. Let's go for it. Because yeah, like chapter 2 and 3 were very closely linked together. It's not Mithril Mines, is it? It's why am I'm
Those
blanking
Mithril
now.
Mines.
Is it?
Yeah. After the Grasslands, Mithril Mines, then
Yeah.
Junon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, chapter 2 and 3 were very closely linked, and then chapters 4, 5, and 6 were very closely linked as well.
Okay.
Which is obviously the other side of things.
Yeah.
Lots of kind of things happening around that, because that's when you go to the Junon area.
Yep.
But then 5 and 6 is essentially the quick story progression chapters before you then get to the next open world area.
Yeah.
But that's when things started to get a bit less clear. But also you can see how like it started to take people longer to migrate. So chapters, people were getting the most chapter 2 and 3 trophies between sort of days 2 and 5 of after release, essentially. So that was when there was like the biggest growth of trophy acquisition for chapters 2 and 3, and then they kind of just gradually moved on to 4 and 5. But then moving on from 4, 5, and 6 typically took people almost 2 weeks. So yeah, progressing from Junon to Costa del Sol typically took people 2 physical weeks to progress.
Fair.
I wonder,
which is crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk for a second about the pacing of the first part of the game. Like, it's obviously you have some open world segments, and you talk about these tighter story driven chapters as we kind of bridge this kind of first half of Rebirth into some of the findings for the second half. I wonder what to you guys speaks to you about the way that people are enjoying the game based on how you played it. I'd love for people to share in the Discord and in the comments kind of how you experience like the pacing and the flow. It seems like some parts of the story had a lot of momentum for folks, and sometimes people really wanted to linger or take a little break. In your experience, kind of from what we've talked about, what does that look like, and what do you think it says about the pacing that they really facilitated for this game?
I think that up until sort of chapter 7, there was a clear delineation in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. So the open world stuff, I think, meshed quite well with the very purposeful story segments. I think after that, the illusion started to break a little bit. Gongaga was it's probably the love-hate region, and I think for some people that it essentially took the fun out of the open world aspect, and obviously then would make more focus be placed on the story driven stuff that was happening. And I think around that time was when I started to see in the trophies especially that people started to drop off a little bit. It wasn't so like the chapters 2 and 3 and 4 to 6 and 7, 8 as well, which they were very, very clear blocks of people playing this and progressing at a fast pace. When it started to get to sort of chapter 9 and 10, trophy progression started to slow down. It wasn't as clear anymore. People were, and this is where essentially I would see that people were giving up on the game. They were maybe either getting bored of it, or life commitments got in the way, and they were thinking, oh geez, like, by that point, most people were at chapter 9. Like when the most trophies were being acquired in chapter 9 was essentially like a month after the game had come out.
What's happening in the story there? Just so that we're kind of caught up. Everybody's
that is around like Wu-Tai-ish, right? It's
Gungaga.
Gungaga Wu-Tai, yeah. So it's
like when you're starting to get some of those threads about Glenn and Wu-Tai, but also Gungaga moving into Cosmo Canyon. That's
what did I say? Wu-Tai.
I tried to save you there, but it was, but no, it was kind of moving into
Take it
Cosmo.
Easy, everybody. We're just chatting, okay? This isn't a recorded encyclopedia. Just hang in there.
Well, to all of those points, Darryl, that's actually really in line with my playthrough.
Really?
Because it really is. Because I remember I left to go on a trip for spring break late March, and I had just arrived at Costa del Sol the day before I left. And that was intentional because I wanted to go to the beach from the beach. That was my mindset, because I'm sick in my mind. I have to role play in real life when I'm playing in the game.
He told me about it.
I did. I was like,
here's what I'm going to do. That's like,
literally. And then I go to Savannah, Georgia, and I make the group that I'm with rent Segways, or as we called them, wheelies. Okay. And like, I made us do that because I'm sick. Okay. I'm a sick person. Anyway, but to these statistics, I know that it took me that long. I didn't beat chapter 14 until I don't know, late April. So a solid 2 months afterwards.
Darryl, I know that you had to blitz it because you were kind of working through it. But what was your experience with the pacing up to that point?
I think that during the first half of the game, I was basically just having the most fangasms ever. I was, everything that they were doing was I'm like, after remake, it was one of those things where like no one knew what to expect with remake, and obviously like they introduced lots of things that were unexpected, so to speak. And I remember when I finished remake, initially I was kind of like, why? But then I sort of thought, well, honestly, it's on them to prove to me that this was a good decision, because you can't, like, with what they did at the end of remake, it's an incomplete story, and I don't like to judge things until you've reached the conclusion, because ultimately, like, I've played enough games to know that a good ending can completely change your perspective on the entire thing. And it can turn a very a mediocre story into a really good story, depending on how they wrap it up and explain everything, and like when everything all comes together and you get the big reveals and those kind of things. And so I was like, well, really the onus is on them now to show me that this has been a good decision, and I can't make that judgment yet. So when I went into Rebirth, I was approaching it with that mindset. So I was kind of in my mind thinking like, well, how are they going to handle this? And then I remember the first time, I mean, like, obviously from an analytical perspective, when I did the prologue, I was looking at how they'd kind of changed things around and the logical way that they'd done things. Obviously, like Sephiroth doesn't fight against the Red Dragon anymore, and like all these different things that they were trying to do to basically say like, yeah, no, it's the same game, but we're modifying it, and this is why, because it makes sense to do so. And then when the Midgard Sorma, I always still want to call it the Midgard Zolom.
Yeah.
The Midgard Sorma fight happened. I was like, okay, how are they gonna do this? Like, how are they gonna show like the big pike and everything? And then they did it, and like you've got the whole underwater segment and everything. And I was like, where is this going? And then at the end of it, I was just kind of like, kind of worked actually. I think what they did makes sense. Like fine, like.
Do
And
you
then
mean by the end of that sequence or by the end of Rebirth?
by the end of
It
that
made
sequence,
sense. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, I was essentially at peace with how they had modified that segment of the story,
Okay.
and I thought the way they'd gone about it was in keeping with what I wanted to see. Essentially, they changed it, but not in a bad way, not in a negative way, in my mind. They'd used the context of the story to modify it, and it made sense to me.
Yeah.
And I kind of like went through the first half of the game very much. All of the things that they were modifying and changing, I thought they had done really sensitively and really purposefully.
Yeah.
I think in the second half of the game, because of like the pacing starts to change around a little bit, there are like boss gauntlets that come out of nowhere all of a sudden, and all these different things. Like some of the stuff from remake that just didn't vibe that well. I mean, like there is a boss fight that happens in the Nibelheim Mansion where you're in charge of one specific character, and that is a choice. And
Yeah.
and
You
they
can
also
speak
made some
freely
other
here.
decisions. I don't want to ruin things for people that have not experienced it themselves.
It's a full spoiler
So,
show.
This
so
entire
you're-
series
yeah, you're
is
good.
full spoiler.
Fine.
So you
You can
can.
choose
that
to
case-
withhold. It's
in
okay.
that case,
You can also.
Kate Sith versus the yin and yang
Yeah, that is a difficult
is-
fight.
and when you play on hard mode,
Hard
it
mode.
is the absolute worst.
Yeah.
But they also started to make some decisions that I was kind of like a bit on the fence about, and I think one of them, weirdly enough, was about how they introduced Vincent to the cast, because I was in my mind thinking, okay, so Vincent is arguably one of the most powerful characters canonically in the franchise.
Right.
He is up there with the best of them. Like, in terms of the power tiering and all this kind of stuff, it's,
Right.
he's on the level of the most powerful characters. And the way they introduced him, they make you fight against him. And I was like, okay, but then you beat him.
Right.
And then I was like, well, but it wasn't like a kind of like, sometimes they do the narrative ones where it's kind of like, oh, like I was holding back kind of thing. It actually looked like you pasted him and he was really not in a good place afterwards. He kind of like skulks off and he's really annoyed about the fact that he's been bested. And then all of a sudden he's like, yeah, actually, I'm going to join you. And I was thinking, well, we've just proven that you're actually not that strong. Why would we really want your help?
That's a fair critique, I would say.
I think it's a good dichotomy, though, saying this is why this section felt good to me based on the heritage. Because a question I was going to ask was, how do you know when you feel good putting a bow on a segment, and then when do you withhold judgment till the end, right? Because that's a hard thing to know. But I think you just perfectly illustrated. This felt good, like a good, authentic change that was fitting with where we were headed. And here is one that felt a little hollow and untrue to the spirit and the reality of the new telling of this game. So I appreciate you kind of offering those two distinctions.
Yeah, and maybe I'm alone in that sentiment in terms of like how I feel as though they represented Vincent in the game, but I feel as though that area around there was where certain aspects of the game started to kind of lose their luster a bit. I think the open world stuff, which I absolutely loved in Calm and Junon and even
Cosmo.
One before Corel, sorry. There were certain things that they made design choices around that kind of made things a little bit cumbersome. Such as, with Corel, you can't do the whole region in one go. They kind of block you from progressing to doing the next part, but it's kind of like not really clear because you can accept side quests that require you to go to a region you don't know about yet, and you try and get there, and it's kind of obvious you're not allowed to go there, but it's not very clearly to be like, you need to go here You need to go here.
Yeah.
And maybe that's like modern gaming in terms of expectations about stuff, but it's kind of, it was a bit frustrating to have like everything up to that point be you can do things whenever you want. But at this point, actually, you can't do that. You can't finish that side quest that you've started, and it's the only one.
Yeah.
And that kind of grated on me a little bit. And then the same thing happened in the other part of Corel with the Gilgamesh quest, where you can't finish it until you've progressed a certain point in the story. But
The proto
you can
relics,
do you can do Cosmo Canyon and you can do Nibelheim proto relic before you finish the Corel one, just because for some reason. So those kind of things, like with my I need to get things I need to finish. They started to frustrate me a little bit, and then obviously like the design of some of the areas as well. Like Gongaga was a bit of a frustrating zone to navigate certain parts of it. Like they designed, there was one quest where I was pretty convinced that you had to access it from the airfield to get there. Because I was like, there's a big door here. It's probably going to unlock at some point, like they've just done to me in Corel.
Right.
And then it didn't. So I got towards the end of the game and I was like, well, I still haven't done this. I must have to navigate some other way to it. And it wasn't, navigating that jungle is troublesome at the best of times. And then obviously Cosmo Canyon has the air flight mechanics and stuff, which had similar things.
Darryl.
So it started to become a bit frustrating with regards to completing the world intel.
Right.
Darryl, did you know that Wade doesn't use fast travel or mini maps in any game until he has learned it by memory?
Yeah. This is again.
I mean, I played Final Fantasy 11.
Oh yeah.
And that game, I still remember how to navigate from everywhere in that game because you had to walk everywhere. So I appreciate that. But Gongaga was still a horrible place to try and navigate.
So I found Gongaga to be a delight without the mini map because I was so focused on
it's
landmarks. It's terribly confusing, but it made logical sense when I wasn't looking at the map. I can't explain it other than, you notice the tiki torches or whatever that are leading you up to the village, or this path up to this mushroom that bounces. Now a lot of people have rightful critiques of that, and I do think that it could be a little bit more illustrated on the maps, in the mini maps, but that was a game changer for me. I turned off the mini map and it made it a lot more. You bring up something, Darryl, and I want to go back to this. You mentioned the Midgard-Stormer and how it worked, even though it did change some of the things. And I've thought about this a little bit, but this is a great example of why it works. You have this moment where in the original game, in the 1997 game, the party comes up and they see this giant snake on a pike. And they ask this question, did Sephiroth do this? Now, in this telling, you go through the swamp or the marsh, and you fight the Midgard soul. I almost did it. Midgard-Stormer, Midgard-Zolom. It's in my head. It's in my heart. And after you beat it, you're brought underwater, and then
you lose, right? You lose.
Yeah, you essentially lose, and then Sephiroth appears underwater, and the next thing you know, he's thrown sliced the snake, and he's thrown him into the air, and he ends up on the pike. But then Cloud comes to, Aerith wakes him up, and everybody's kind of out there, and the question in the player's mind is, did Sephiroth do this, or was it Cloud? And so you have this almost kind of it's not really meta, but it does invoke that same question of, is this Sephiroth? Is this Cloud? And they play with that for 13 more chapters at that point, which I think is such a cool allusion to the original game, but also it enhances that original story. I wonder, are there any other points in that game that you're like, this enhanced what the original was going for, story-wise?
I think that, from a party perspective, I think one of the unsung heroes of Rebirth is Yuffie.
Oh yes,
and what I feel as though she adds that the original game didn't was a real dynamic. Like
Mm.
going through Rebirth, it was very similar to the original game in that generally when the characters talk to each other, it's for a purposeful thing. They have something they want to accomplish or achieve, or they need to talk about something that's happened. Yuffie was the only character that talked to everyone in the party and never had that be her objective. She was often trying to just make someone feel good or make someone feel seen or included. I think she's the only character in the game that actually talks to Red 13 in a just to want to talk to him and just give him a stroke, like everyone else is just wanting to mine information from him or he's just an inconvenience. And she has the fun interactions with Barrett all the time. No one else really has that kind of playfulness with Barrett. It's always super serious with him and all the other characters. So I think she has like these unique relationships with every single character that I feel in a way embodies the player. Like the kind of she brings out the sides of these characters that everyone wishes they could see, but without her there, which in Remake you never got to see any of that really. They were all very much on the mission, like super serious most of the time. There were obviously occasional silly scenes, and like Aerith and Tifa had kind of their character development between them. But even Yuffie helps to enhance that and bring that up to a whole new level with like just what the chaos that she brings to the table. And I think that was one of the things that I found really curious because I saw a lot of commentary afterwards about people who felt that Yuffie was super annoying and all these kind of things. And I kind of felt like they'd missed something in terms of what she's supposed to be and who she was supposed to be interacting with and how. But it also did bring out a very interesting point about Rebirth in that, they in the messaging, they tried to make it very clear that it's a standalone game. You don't have to have played anything else to get the full experience. But it's just, I don't know how you could go into Rebirth and get that full experience without having played the first game as a minimum. And also like intermission, like you need to understand where these characters are coming from, the development, and really, my mass appreciation from Yuffie comes from when I played the first game on PC all those years ago. She was in my final party to beat Sephiroth because
was she really?
Yeah.
You may be the first person I've talked to who has said that.
That's amazing. I used her because I had her on a level 1 limit break. So anytime she took any damage, she would just get a limit break immediately and just grease lightning. Go, spam it.
Oh, that's smart. Okay.
But I also thought she was just I thought she was really cute as opposed to annoying. But then I think they did a really good job in the compilation of building her character out. And a lot of people never got experience to that or exposure to that. Like the relationship she has with her father is actually really powerful. And, it goes a lot to explain why she is the way that she is. And the fact that she's kind of caught between these two worlds of having to be this grown-up person who essentially has the entire hopes and dreams of her nation on her shoulders because she feels as though everyone else has essentially quit. But also the fact that she still is ultimately a kid. And I think it's like they've done a really good job of showing that side of her in Rebirth where she is super silly, but she's also got probably the kindest heart of anyone in that group. Just naturally. I think Aerith is obviously, she's got a lot of empathy, but it seems to be coming from a place of kind of, wanting to get, she knows what she needs to do essentially. Whereas Yuffie she doesn't really have an ulterior motive. Like, what is her benefit to becoming besties with Red 13? Like, there isn't really any. Like, unless she thinks that somehow he's going to give her some great materia. But
right?
But I feel as though even that like trope-defining trait of hers has been softened a lot in Rebirth, and I'm really curious to see how they're gonna deal with that in the next part, which I'm sure they will.
No, I'm very curious how Wutai is going to play out.
I think it's going to be very different.
Especially as the world is at war. At this point, there's the Wutai-Shinra war going on, and a dynamic with her father. I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be amazing. I can't wait.
They've given themselves a lot more room to work.
Well, they have, and they have given. They've given such context to these characters, and that's kind of a daunting task for part 3 to go into the Vincent, the Sid, and the full Yuffie backstories there. I mean, I will be amazed at the size of this game, I'm sure, once we get into it.
And it's whether they do that as well. I mean, like,
Fair.
how they chose to handle some of the topics in the first 2 games. I mean, they've chosen to just flat out ignore some of the things that happened because it probably isn't appropriate to do it in that way, or they just can't do it in that way. One of the scenes that my wife Laura and I always used to talk about was that at the Temple of the Ancients, Cloud literally beats Aerith
Attacks,
up,
yeah.
and
Yes.
the other party members have to drag him off her. Like, there's no way they could have done that in or maybe they could have done, but I think it would have been very controversial had they done.
It would have been.
And Sid, obviously, in his relationship with Shira is similar-ish. If they're going to do it, they're going to have to do it in a way that doesn't change the sentiment, but also isn't inappropriate.
Yeah. I think it's such a challenge to take this beloved game and then to modernize it in this way, not just from a graphical standpoint and technological, but certainly from these themes and cultural sensibilities have changed over the course of 30 some odd years. And that's one of those challenges that they seem up to the task. You mentioned earlier, however, that remake not only it appears that this trilogy is not just changing things for the sake of changing them, but a lot of the director ambitions were left on the cutting room floor back in 1997. In your knowledge and research about some of the original intentions, what are some things that you might be able to share with us saying, this is maybe an evolution of some of those former ideas?
I think it's tough because obviously the compilation existed as a way of expanding on a lot of that already. I feel as though remake is then essentially extending what they have tried to do there, which is they've talked about that in itself and their objectives there. But I think very much there are certain elements where they want to do more. I mean, obviously Vincent and Yuffie were almost completely cut from the game because of time constraints, but then they were able to get them back in the way they wanted. And I think that with the compilation, if you look at how it built out, the 3 characters that actually got more focus than anyone else were Yuffie, Vincent, and Sid. They have a lot more screen time than, I mean, Dirge of Cerberus is essentially about those 3 characters.
Right.
The rest of the cast kind of disappear. And even Crisis Core spends more time on Yuffie than some of the other characters too. It was interesting that it felt like they had a point to prove in that these characters didn't get the love that they wanted them to get in the original game. So now we're actually going to build them out and make them have a lot more substance. And Vincent was huge in terms of Dirge of Cerberus built out so much of his backstory in a way that just no one really had any idea about. It made stuff very, very clear in terms of his relationship with Hojo, his relationship with Shinra, his relationship with Lucrezia, his relationship with Sephiroth. Because obviously the original game had some of that available, but not with a huge degree of context. But it also helped to, I think, Dirge of Cerberus, I mean, it gets a lot of flack, some of it justifiable. But I think the story aspects of that game were actually incredibly strong. And I think the way it built out the lore of Final Fantasy VII is probably one of my favorite properties for doing that in a way. I think Crisis Core is good, but I think that Dirge of Cerberus, with the way it introduced characters and tied them to the world, was probably one of my favorites for its ability to do that. Like the Soviets, I think, are great characters.
Yeah.
I think all the backstory about the Restrictors and Sector Zero, Deep Ground, I think it added a lot. And with Rebirth, I was really surprised to see that they didn't delve further into that, because of obviously how they alluded to it in Remake, and then there was a
Intermission,
focal
yeah.
point in Intermission, and then it just kind of disappeared, um, which was curious, because obviously like those, we know those characters are in the world now. Like, where have they gone? What have they been doing this whole time?
Well, and it makes you wonder if Deep Ground exists, if Vice and Nero exist. Where's Genesis, right? Where
Hmm.
are all of these others from the compilation? So again, heavy lifting in part three. A clarification, because so many of our audience, we throw around terms in the Final Fantasy community, and everybody knows those things. You mentioned Dirge of Cerberus, and shockingly, you said that story is incredibly compelling. That is a hot take, both in Final Fantasy community, and other people are like, I didn't know there was another thing, Dirge of Cerberus, right? Explain, if you could briefly, what that game means for the lore of the Final Fantasy VII universe. It's focused on Vincent, but what does it do to that character and the overall lore?
So I think the one thing it does is help to quantify uh, Shinra's depravity,
Hmm.
because you get to really understand a lot more about what was actually going on. I think it does a really good job of amplifying Hojo as a real villain. I think the
Hmm.
original game, obviously, he's an evil scientist, but it's not until Dirge of Cerberus that you truly start to understand and realize he's a despicable human being,
Hmm.
and in ways that people probably hadn't anticipated. Like the depths that he goes to, the choices he's made. I mean, obviously, like within the original game, we knew about the context of how Sephiroth was conceived because of everything relating to Gast, but we didn't know quite what went down.
Yeah.
But also, I think one of the interesting dynamics around it was, the love triangle that exists with Lucrezia, Hojo, and Vincent. Obviously, we weren't too aware of that. Grimoire Valentine, I think, is a good foil for Lucrezia as well in terms of like the relationship. But I think again, I think the Sviets were really good characters too, for helping to introduce something new to the
And the
franchise.
Sviets, just refresh us a little bit. The Sviets are who?
They're essentially like a Metal Gear Solid band of enemies that are like this color coded troop
Yeah, like
of enemies who all
Azure
have,
something. Yeah.
yeah, they've all
Um,
got like Spanish names.
yeah.
And yeah, so but they all adopt essentially different traits, and it's one of those things where they provide Vincent with a different challenge that he has to overcome.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that's curious about it is that in the main game, so much focus is placed around Sephiroth being like the supreme being, and you don't really encounter anything else or anyone else that is on a level with him outside of the protagonists themselves. And Dirge of Cerberus introduces this kind of group of characters who are incredibly powerful, and it kind of shows in a weird way that Shinra had all these things that they could have done, just chose not to. You
Hmm.
know, they just had these massive band of super soldiers just sitting up, down in the depths while Sephiroth's running amok. They could have just let them loose. They probably could have challenged Sephiroth more effectively than the main protagonists of Final Fantasy VII, but they were just kind of rocking around down there. But I think, yeah, like the things that it introduces, the Shulk is a great character as well. Shulk is the sister of one of the Sviets who has similar to Barrett and Dine, like only one arm, but she's really great at technology. But there's also the whole dynamic essentially about what happens after Final Fantasy VII. And I think Dirge of Cerberus does a much better job of depicting everything that's happening than
Hmm.
Advent Children. Because of what Advent Children was, it was very self-contained. They kind of show some bits of it, but it was very much centered around, okay, Sephiroth's still evil, he's still doing stuff. Sephiroth doesn't exist in Dirge of Cerberus's world.
Right.
He's not even really a focal point. It's more of a kind of, I guess, a humanized version of the story, which is about people's struggle to survive. in different angles. You've got Hojo's struggle to survive because he's essentially lost his body. He's a digital form now. He's trying to take someone else's over. The Spheyettes are trying to free themselves from Shinra's grasp and trying to claim their own identity. Vincent is doing the same thing. He doesn't want to be beholden to chaos anymore. You also have all of the citizens who are like essentially trying to rebuild their lives, and then you've got Hojo who's trying to destroy the planet in a way that I think was more succinctly demonstrated than what Sephiroth was trying to accomplish. Like Sephiroth's goals are clear, but they're also slightly ambiguous. I think, like, we know he wants to destroy the planet, but beyond that, I think there are a degree of people that are just like, but what's the end goal here? It's kind of like the typical maniacal Final Fantasy boss. They just want to end everything, and you're just like, but why?
Do you think that's being cleared up in Rebirth?
I think a little bit.
Okay.
But I think, obviously with the way the story's going, the end goal is still slightly ambiguous with regards to what Sephiroth's trying to accomplish. I think Hojo's motivations were incredibly transparent. Like, he wanted to essentially, I mean, it was very similar to 13, the 13 narrative arc. But essentially, yeah, he wants to bring about a cataclysmic destruction event similar to Sephiroth, but without destroying the planet in the process, so that he can claim Omega Weapon, which is essentially this supreme weapon that is the last resort of the planet to survive. And he wants to claim ownership of Omega Weapon so that he can become this huge interstellar being, essentially to become a new Genova.
Mm-hmm.
And then go to new planets and conquer and stuff like that. I don't know if that was necessarily Sephiroth's aim. He just wanted to just kind of be the...
That's an incredibly compelling read on Dirge of Cerberus. Because I've watched and read so many things on Dirge, and it is not very well liked. But in the way that you've described it, especially in the remake trilogy, there's a groundedness that I could see us evolving into. And even the subtle changes, not really changes, but enhancements of Hojo, I just see it as like, he is bad. Like, he's not this goofy, like, Christopher Lloyd scientist in Back to the Future. He is maniacal and evil, and I'm excited to see that escalation. We see it a little bit with Roche and some of the just experimentation and the, he has no concern for human life and all of that. Evan, we've gone down all kinds of rabbit trails. Where would you take us?
Well, I think the rabbit trails are exactly what we need to talk about next.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, you mentioned earlier on in our discussion how they want people to not have needed to have interacted with all these different side properties or even have played the first game to really be able to enjoy and appreciate where they're headed with these new ones. How do you think people balance that, especially given the tracking of how far people are making it in these games and at what pace they were accomplishing and achieving different trophies and goals as the games have gone on? How do you think they balance that, where you are seeing depth in places that need to be substantiated by a significant amount of playtime and experience, but then they're trying to write these characters in a way that lives on their own? Do you think it's working? Like, are they pulling it off? Is it being well received? Or is this game really great, but the best of it gets segmented with people who really need to understand all these different rabbit trails and tendrils to really enjoy what the game is? And is that a bit naturally gatekeeping for their ultimate success?
Yes, I believe it is. I think they have, altruistic ambitions of what they've tried to accomplish. But I think Remake itself, very early on, showed the pitfalls of the approach they've taken. Because Remake introduced a specific set of characters who were introduced in a very fringe novel. Kyrie, Leslie. And when I did my survey on Remake, those characters were universally disliked by everyone. they didn't do a very good job of making you care about those characters because you needed to care about the characters. They just assumed that these are going to be fun, like, nods and allusions that people are going to get a big kick out of. But they forgot about the fact that very few people are going to have read that novel.
Right.
And if you haven't read that novel and you don't have all the context around these characters, you need to actually have a reason to want to go and read the novel to find out about these characters. And there wasn't really a reason provided. Excuse me. I think that was one of the challenges with what they've done around it, that they've made a lot of assumptions in terms of it, and it does get hard to try and get invested in the world without having all these different contexts available. I think you've said about it, Wade, in terms of like, would you recommend playing 7 first before remake? And I think it's hard to recommend not doing that because you gain so much from playing the original game, and it helps to ground everything in remake. And I think you'll get to see these characters in ways they were kind of originally intended back then, and obviously now you're seeing the evolved version of how these characters have evolved, and what we touched on with Cloud in terms of how Cloud has changed over time based on consumer reception or what they perceive people want Cloud to be. But in the original version of the game, Cloud isn't that. So you get to kind of like draw your own conclusions about, what is Cloud, who is Cloud. And I think, with regards to the compilation and how it's kind of building out and all these different things, it's the same with Deep Ground, really. Like, if you have no idea if you didn't play Dirge of Cerberus and you don't know who Nero and Vise are and stuff, I mean, they did a decent job of like making you really dislike Nero.
Yeah.
But then it's gone nowhere. I think with Rebirth, what I actually liked was that they kind of turned some of these characters around. Like Kyrie actually had some fun moments, right? She wasn't the same character in Rebirth as she was in Remake. Roche redeemed himself slightly, and then kind of, because that, I mean, I remember having a conversation about this after Remake in terms of these specific characters, and Roche in the survey was a character that people just did not resonate with.
Yeah.
Especially people in Europe. People in Europe
Really?
just really did not like Roche.
Any idea why?
I mean, as a European,
you're the most qualified
I think
one on the screen to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think there was the way that his personality was portrayed. It was just odd that this is a soldier who, he's not a first-class soldier or anything of note, really, but he's been given this massive platform, and it just seemed really strange, and it didn't really seem like it had that much purpose. And obviously we learned later that Roche was supposed to have a lot more scenes in Remake, and there was supposed to be a lot more of a relationship built between him and Cloud that made sense, but they ended up cutting a lot of it because they just didn't have time, or because it didn't make sense ultimately in the end. But I think they kind of just left him out to dry, and the scenes that were there, I guess based on how we like to see characters, it just seemed like that kind of like bold, brash, unnecessarily aggressive character, and there was no payoff for it because he just kind of disappeared. I think in Rebirth, they lent into it, but they made it a lot more fun. If that, like, the whole scene in Junon was, it was very different from Remake. Like, thematically, it was very similar. He's still doing the same things, but they just really amped it up and made it just really campy and like all these different things. And like, they made it in a way like you felt sorry for the guy.
Yeah.
Like, he's really trying hard, but you didn't really get that sentiment or feeling in Remake. He was just kind of annoying.
I have questions about some of these design decisions when it comes to some of these characters, because I think there are moments that make absolutely no sense if you have no context for them. And they're kind of critical moments. Like, it's really hard to make a game with this much depth and love with these characters and these side IPs and products that is satisfying to everyone. And I think the person who gets left out to dry the most is the person who's playing it for the very first time. I cannot convince my friends who have not played Final Fantasy games to even try 7 Remake, because it's the most encapsulated story. I mean, it's just a little story about Midgar in itself, and it's entirely unapproachable, and it's not something they're interested in spending their time on. And so that's a problem. Either you have to make a game so good that your core audience absolutely falls in love with it, or you kind of have this cliff where it drops off. Do you think when it comes to some of these characters and how we interpret their moods and who they are, that, let me ask it in a better way that's not yes or no. What impact do you think having voice acting and direction has changed the way that people interact and perceive these characters, from being able to infer tone through written text based on how you would interpret your values of the character in the original?
So that's actually a fascinating question, and I'm going to do what I would do in my videos by using someone else to answer it. So I remember reading a quote from Nojima, who's obviously the scenario writer of Remake, and he specifically addressed this because, and I found it when I'm working on my character origins videos, when you're working with scripts that are just written, you don't really have, I mean, they can like in the older games, they had like the funny animations and stuff that they could do to try and get some kind of intent over. But you can interpret those scripts in so many different ways, depending on how you're perceiving that scene playing out. Voice acting and the way that the characters are working now, it takes all of that out of the equation. Like it's literally like paint by numbers in terms of how they want you to perceive this scene. And everything is crafted in a way to make sure that everyone perceives it in pretty much the same way. And they actually talked about how that was one of the biggest struggles in terms of translating 7 to Remake, because they knew that people had interpreted scenes in ways that they had not expected or anticipated. And they then had to navigate, well, how do we recreate the scene and still make those people feel that it's the same scene? It's a very, very difficult skill. But I think it's also one of the things that the older role-playing games without voice acting actually benefited from. And I always think back to like the original Final Fantasy, how there were characters in that game, like Matoya, for example, or Bikken. They are in the story. They probably have like 2 lines of dialogue.
Right.
But they're still incredibly memorable characters, and they're memorable because you have to do so much heavy lifting on your own to figure out, who is this person? Why are they here? What is their role in this world? Like, you have to build all these narratives yourself, and that was part of the whole thing of role playing, right? It's you're building, like those older games especially, you're building all of these backstories and things around these characters, whereas now everything is literally done for you. And I think that's in some ways one of my bugbears around Remake and Rebirth, and what they have done with the compilation in itself is that they have explained everything. There is not really any room for interpretation or imagination anymore. And like even the fact that, you know, before there was a theory, it was a fun theory about, you know, what are the summons in 7? You know, are they former weapons? Like, who knows? But in Rebirth, they've introduced lore for all of them and stuff. And I was like, did they really need to do that? Like, could they have just left it so that there's some things that are, you know, people can still have down to their own interpretation and just kind of like let people believe what they want to believe? Because when it comes to other things, like when Katazi talks about theories, he's always happy to let people believe what they want to believe. Like, he's not going to tell people. I mean, he even retracted some of his previous statements about Renault and Ultimacia and all these kind of things. But with this project, they seem to want to talk about everything and leave nothing to interpretation whatsoever, which I get. And, you know, people that are absolutely obsessed with the lore of Final Fantasy VII, for them, it's like Christmas. But I kind of prefer lore when it's a bit more ambiguous, and it makes me think like how do I interpret this? And that's some of the, like when I used to do the character origin videos more prevalently. Even games like Final Fantasy X, actually, where they were still kind of finding their feet. There was still so much nuance in all of the scenes, and they also didn't explicitly say everything. Like you had to try and piece things together yourself and draw like conclusions and investigate. And then like sometimes they'll put stuff in Ultimania guidebooks where you're just like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like, it's really cool. But I think because of how big Seven has got now, because there's so many games and it's expanding all the time, they just feel the need that they need to keep adding new stuff.
Yeah.
Like, and it kind of is. It's getting tough, and I would prefer that they add new characters, honestly, and introduce new things, and like that's probably why I like Dirge of Cerberus so much, because the characters they added actually felt like good characters. They weren't like Kyrie and Leslie in Remake. Yeah. Like I wanted to find out more about these characters, and if they do ever get to that point in Ever Crisis, it would be nice to see how they deal with them. And it always makes me lament the fact that they never did that Genesis follow-up game.
You said that you like the Genesis follow-up game would have been amazing, but you said that you like when they are creating new characters. I'm very curious here at the end of our time together what your opinion on the Whispers are. They're a new element. And so did that work for you or not?
And please only answer in the voice of a whisper.
I think with the Whispers, the jury is still out.
Okay.
As I said before, I need to wait to see, and this was like when I finished Rebirth. My overriding sentiment was they haven't justified their decision to me yet.
Yeah.
But hopefully they do at the end of the next game.
Are they closer to it now after Rebirth? Do you feel?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I feel as though I generally like stories to have some kind of self-contained element to them. Something needs to conclude, and I don't think Rebirth really concluded anything.
Boy, that is such a great summation of the tension and frustrations that people have. Do you so even with I don't even know if I can call this a trilogy as much as a 3-part game, right? At the end of the second part of this alleged so-called trilogy, do you feel like it's set up the mysteries well, or it's just fumbling the ball? This isn't really a critique, but it's like they've got a lot of heavy lifting in part 3, right? Thus far, are you more curious than you are frustrated?
Or concerned.
Yeah, or concerned, yeah.
I think kind of all of them in equal measure. I think that, when I was doing my video on the ending explained, and kind of going back and reviewing it, I think actually Tamura from GameSpot talked about it, that when he was looking at it as well. And like, I agree with him that I think kind of the more casual fans will look at the ending of Rebirth and they'll just be like, huh, okay, like that was an ending. Because there's so much stuff happening that you can easily just miss if you aren't like just watching everything with a fine-tooth comb.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's 5 stamps now.
Yeah.
And you really have to be paying attention to be seeing them all and figuring out which continuity or timeline or whatever we're calling them you're in.
Which I love that we haven't talked about at all and won't talk about. Things. It's great.
I don't want that to be the defining legacy of this game. And that's why I'm curious to see how, because essentially they've said that when this, as you said, 3-part series or trilogy or whatever it is concludes, we'll be back to where we started with, which makes me believe that all of it is relevant and irrelevant at the same time.
Say more relevant and irrelevant. How would that be the case?
Well, if they're saying that the story is going to wrap up and we're going to end exactly where we did at the end of the original game, then all of the stuff that they have done will still get to the same conclusion.
And
So
in a game about defying fate, that is they're not landing that.
I mean,
I think it's time for my fan theory. I'm going to reveal it.
Please, Evan, what is your fan theory?
I think screen goes black at the end of the next game. Just a dip to black, and then you wake up, and it's the old graphics from the original game, and Cloud is waking up in the church. And then it's just 2 seconds. You get the old character models, credits roll.
Well, I mean, that is not that wild of a theory, because to this day, there is the opening of the original game where Aerith is by the pipe and there's a Mako leak or whatever, and then the game plays out. Remake starts with that, and some have guessed that she's listening to the planet through that Mako leak, and she sees all of the events of the original game, and now she's playing through it. So that gives her a foreknowledge of everything. It's an interesting thought.
Hey,
so
see, there's the mystery. There's the mystery.
Yeah, there it is.
And honestly, who knows? I mean,
who knows, right?
I am not sure of their creative process, but one thing I am sure of is that these days, when it comes to creating these trilogies, whether it's gaming or movies, they generally don't seem to have it crafted from beginning to end when they start. There is definitely a degree of tailoring that they will do based on what they perceive to be happening, so that the story goes roughly in areas that they feel people want it to.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think like there's been anywhere near as much. I mean, like when Remake happened, people were like just all over the place in terms of that ending. It was absolutely ridiculous. So many theories, speculations. I think that with Rebirth, there has been nowhere near as much of that.
No, there has not been.
And whether that's just a general apathy of, I'm not too sure.
I would be interested in that survey.
Yeah,
to be honest. So,
but I think with Remake and Rebirth, like Remake was kind of that fool me once. Rebirth was the fool me twice. And I'm curious to see. That's why I'm very curious to see what happens with the next part, because I think they will have lost more people because of what happened for sure. You've obviously got the people that are invested and they want to see it through because of sunk time and sunk cost and everything. But I'm hoping that by the time they get to the end of the story, that everything they've done has a logical reason for happening.
He answered the stick the landing question.
He just did.
We usually end this interview segment with, what is it going to take for them to stick the landing? And you just did that. They have reasonable explanation.
So since you answered that question, I want to close out like this. I have a few questions that I ask absolutely everybody. However, you have established throughout this entire conversation that you don't theorize. Like, you haven't said that, but every time I ask you, or either of us ask you about what do you think is going on here, you go back to the facts, the evidence. And that's what I love about your channel, because it's not about conjecture or any of that. It's like, this is what we know. And it could lead to any of these things, but this is what we know. So based on that sort of thing, your opinions and your ideas have a level of gravitas. I don't know if you've realized that, but it's one of the things I appreciate most about you. That said, end of Remake, just give me one phrase, yes or no, and then a small phrase of clarification. First question, is Aerith dead?
To about end of Rebirth?
By the end of Rebirth.
Sorry, I had to clarify.
Yes or no, and a brief clarification.
I say yes and no.
Okay.
That with the accent delivery is just.
Can you clarify it?
Get away with so much
briefly?
more than we can.
I think that from what they've shown, she will be physically dead, but not spiritually dead.
Okay. Second question. I'm not even going to follow up on that because Number 2, Zach. Dead or
No,
alive?
don't ask a question. Number 2, Zach.
Zach.
Go.
Yeah. Yes or no? Is he dead?
I'm gonna have to say the same answer,
Same
yes
thing. Okay.
and no, because in some instances he is, and some instances he isn't.
Are we dealing with a multiverse?
Is this number 3? You didn't say number 3.
This is number 3. Are we dealing with a multiverse? How do you reckon with that briefly?
I believe so. I mean, they've pretty much said so themselves, right?
Okay. So is that how is that grounded in the lore of the game to you? Knowing what you do about seriously, you may be the most qualified person to answer this because of your knowledge of Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core and the compilation and every interview and all that kind of stuff. How is that rooted in the saga of the original Final Fantasy VII? Or is it?
I think it is. And I think it goes back to that point we had around Sephiroth's skull.
Okay.
Part of me wonders whether or not they felt that Sephiroth's goal in the original was. I mean, like if you think about the Final Fantasy villains from 1 through 5, a lot of them were kind of nihilistic. I want to end the world. Like I want everything to cease to like go to the void, kind of thing. And Sephiroth's objectives could have been perceived that way. I think they wanted to make his objectives a bit more transparent, but also amplified. So from my understanding, he wants to not just become the overlord of the current domain, but all domains. And that's obviously how they can build up to the final conclusion, because, I mean, they touched on it with Rebirth. If you think about the evolution of how it's gone, and I love evolutions, you know, in Remake, you fight, well, in original 7, you fight against a version of Sephiroth that is, aggrandized. You know, it's the safer Sephiroth, but it's still very much grounded in that reality. In Remake, you're fighting against Sephiroth, who has been combined with another external entity, which has amplified him. In Rebirth, you're fighting against Sephiroth, who is kind of split between multiverses. You're fighting against different iterations of Sephiroth who are merging together. And in Rebirth, well, whatever is third, it would then make logical sense for the Sephiroth you fight at the end, because you're obviously going to fight against Sephiroth at the end.
Of course.
To basically be the combination of all of it. I'd imagine he gets to the point where he essentially wins, and you have to be the thing that stops the final thing that means he wins, which is then defeating him in his strongest form.
In
which
his
would be
strongest
a combined Sephiroth's.
This is the first time that I've heard this one, and that is just a phenomenal idea, because that's been the question some people have asked. How do you top the first Sephiroth fight? What they did it too early, right? Then you've got Rebirth, which is the boss rush that lasted 3 hours, and it's like, how do you top that, right? And I think that you're onto something here. This combination of all Sephiroths across all time and maybe even space in this edge of creation. That's how do you combat that? That's pretty good.
And they also kind of teased in Rebirth that, you know, it's the combination of the allies too. You know, Zack's coming from beyond to assist his team. And, you know, that it very much feels as though Aerith is going to be providing some. I mean, I don't know if she's going to be playable in the next game. I think if they don't have her playable, that's going to be jarring for some people. But obviously, in the original game, she wasn't playable beyond a certain point. I can see them doing something similar to what they did with Zack, so that she still has some element of playability. But I'd imagine, she will be providing assistance to Cloud, just like she did at the end of Rebirth, right?
Yeah.
She's
the way it sounds, and then I'm going to toss it to Evan, and we're going to end this together, like Aerith and Cloud at the end of Rebirth. We're going to end it together.
Which one of us dies?
or not.
Neither, none of us. Yeah,
And
exactly.
all of us and none of us simultaneously.
I vote
Um,
Wade.
it's a fascinating thing to kind of think about this because the way you've described it, I'm fully bought in as far as like, okay, we've got all of these different worlds, we've got all of these different threads. If they were to nicely package it together, I think they can stick the landing, and it's a hopeful sort of thing. I think that's pretty incredible. So,
Question 5.
again, I knew that you would bring some of this like grounded sort of reasoning into this, and I really really appreciate that. Evan, you want to close us out?
Yep. Question 5. Bangers and
Yeah.
mash or fish and chips?
Ooh,
Probably bangers and mash.
With the gravy?
Yeah, of course.
Gotta have it.
obviously.
But you can also upgrade to toad in a hole.
Educate.
For those that may
That's
not
a
know,
request.
not us.
Educate.
That is when you would have a Yorkshire pudding, which I also appreciate. Probably means nothing. It is essentially a wonderfully crafted piece of batter that some people. Well, if you get a really big toad in a hole, essentially is a huge bowl of batter that is incredibly crispy that you would then fill with stuff. But you can also get mini Yorkshire puddings too, which are quite nice.
It's like a chicken pot pie?
Not really a pie because it's not cooked like that. You'd
It's
have
like
to you'd have to look
filled?
it up. Yeah, it's
Do you have chicken
I
pot
don't know.
pie over there? Do you know what
we
that
might call it
is?
something else.
Listen, I don't
My
like
wife's gone to
chicken pot
sleep, so she wouldn't be able to translate for me.
It's okay. It's all right.
Okay.
Okay, then fine. Question 6. American breakfast? British breakfast?
I'd have to go with a classic English fry up there.
Really?
Ooh.
I like the beans. I kind of like the navy beans in the English breakfast. It feels wrong.
I mean, like, you can't. Like, you got the toast, you've got the sausages, bacon, hash browns are good.
And then
I don't have blood pudding.
the beans.
Black pudding, but I generally don't go for the baked beans actually. But you can get the tomatoes too, which are weirdly put on there.
Oh
It's
no,
an
they're so
assortment of
good.
things.
Oh, they're so good, especially if they're cooked right. It's like, it's just perfect. The texture, it's the biggest variety in texture that you've never expected in a breakfast yet come to expect. Anyways, how can people find you? Thank you so much for being on. Tell us what you have coming up. Anything that you want to share that you're excited about. We'd love to hear you.
What do we have coming up? So, well, first of all, if you type in Final Fantasy Union, you will find us in some shape or form. YouTube is probably the best thing that we do right now. But we also have a newsletter called Wark Digest, which is one of my staff members, Chris, pulls together I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 word email every week about stuff that's going on with regards to Final Fantasy. Then we've got like 6,000 people subscribed.
Yeah, I
to
was
it
going to
now.
say, it's quite well regarded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Chris does a fantastic job. He's a great writer.
Way to go, Chris!
Yes. In terms of other stuff that we've got coming up, so yeah, we're going to be publishing the complete history of Mystic Quest very soon. I always wanted to do those videos. Like, a lot of people do retrospective videos, but they mostly talk about the games themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I focus purely on why the game exists in the way it does. And Mystic Quest has probably one of the most surreal and also insulting stories as to why it exists, because it primarily was predicated on the fact that they thought Americans were dumb. And when with 4, they changed a lot of it on that basis, and then 4 didn't sell very well. So instead of thinking, okay, maybe we did something wrong, they thought, no, you know what it is? Americans are actually more stupid than we thought.
Oh.
Yep.
So we need to make a game that's completely tailored to them and is really dumbed down. And a lot of the developers actually talked about it afterwards, that they thought they learned a lot about Americans because they were like, but weirdly enough, and as I was going through this, I always love going through these old development stories because you see so many parallels to the modern day. A lot of the principles they applied when they were working on Mystic Quest is basically modern game design. bright colors, signposted pathways, like not too many, like basically making people progress through linear paths by making them think they're solving puzzles, like all of the stuff they were putting in there. I was like, isn't there loads of discourse right now about the fact that like Rebirth is like, where do I go? Oh, there's a big yellow thing
Yellow
telling
lines,
you to
yeah.
Guilty as charged.
It makes people think that they found the path on their own, but they really didn't.
They also did the American sounding names in the baseball games. That's one of the best. It's the best illustration of that. Have you never seen this? It's a baseball game that they made in Japan, and we're wrapping up the episode. I can't believe I'm talking about this. And they have names like Todd Bunzales and Anatoly Smorlin. Like basically, you can look up. So everybody, you can go look up it's just close to American sounding names if you didn't speak English. Bobson Dugnut, like it's great. You got to check them out.
Well, it's the same with like that generation of Final Fantasy games as well, because in the Japanese games they used games like Jeff and Edward and Gilbert because to them they were fantasy names, but then they had to localize them in the West because they were like, well, a lot of people probably know someone called Jeff, and it might be a bit, breaking the illusion.
Is that how we ended up with Glenn?
To be in this
pivotal game-changing character, Glenn.
I mean, I'm sure you know the origin story about Glenn Wade.
I do not. Please.
So it was actually a question at the recent pub quiz we did that the characters from the First Soldier were named because at that time Tetsuya Nomura was drinking some green matcha tea, and a green in Japanese would be said Glen kind of thing. And then
Glenn, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then Matt is matcha and
matcha?
T is Luchi.
Oh my gosh. What in the world?
Why?
Okay, well,
why? Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And everybody go and subscribe over on Final Fantasy Union on YouTube. You can also find them on social media and all that kind of stuff. We'll be sure and put the links in the comments. Darryl, thank you so much for giving your time for us today. This has been illuminating. I knew it would be just absolutely amazing. So thank you so much, everybody. We continue our Final Fantasy VII Rebirth lecture series every Tuesday and Thursday with live streams, lecture playthroughs, and then video essays and more interviews just like this. Until next time, walk tall, my friends, and we'll see you in class.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much to Darryl from Final Fantasy Union for the interview. Thanks to Husky by the Geek for the use of our theme music. We just absolutely love it. Thanks to Nick Smith who does our graphics. Nick, make sure you take care of yourself. And thanks to you, viewers, because this program is brought to you by viewers like you. So thanks. Give yourself a pat on the back. We hope everything's going great in your life, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Bye-bye.